You are still the absolute poorest, most worthless member of this family." My father mocked loudly at Christmas dinner, his cruel laughter echoing across the grand dining room. He sat at the head of the long mahogany table, swirling his vintage red wine, reveling in the polite chuckles of the 30 elite municipal judges and corporate investors seated around us. My sister, Victoria, smirked behind her crystal goblet, her neck heavy with diamonds she could not actually afford. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I simply kept my calloused hands folded quietly in my lap, waiting. Then, my cell phone buzzed. It was a sharp mechanical vibration against the polished wood. "Answer it on speaker," my father commanded, a cruel grin stretching across his face. "Let the room hear how your debt collectors speak to you." I tapped the green icon. The voice of my banking executive rang out with crisp, undeniable clarity. "Ma'am, your recent municipal acquisitions have fully cleared. Your liquid account balance has officially reached $850 million. The deafening silence that instantly swallowed the dining room was broken only by the sharp, terrifying sound of Victoria's crystal wine glass slipping from her trembling fingers and shattering into 1,000 pieces on the marble floor. They thought they had backed a helpless domestic victim into a corner. They had no idea they had just handed the keys to their entire universe over to the exact woman they threw away 16 years ago. Have you ever had to sit silently while arrogant relatives tried to tear down your worth? Let me know your story in the comments below, and please hit like and subscribe if you believe hard work always defeats arrogant entitlement. 2 weeks earlier, the harsh bite of early December wind swept through the skeletal remains of an early 20th century textile mill on the industrial edge of the city. I stood on the cavernous ground floor, the air thick with the sharp scent of oxidized metal and freezing rain. Sparks rained down from the steel rafters 50 feet above my head, casting harsh, brilliant flashes of light over the cracked concrete as my crews worked to reinforce the primary support beams. I pulled a pair of heavy leather work gloves from my back pocket and reviewed the structural reinforcement manifests clipped to my board. A site foreman in a bright yellow hard hat walked past, handing me a massive purchase order for raw construction steel. I scanned the dense document, checked the supply chain metrics, and signed my name at the bottom, quietly authorizing the transfer of $2 million without a single second of hesitation. This was the grinding, relentless reality of Apex reclamation. Over the past 16 years, I had quietly acquired and restored over 40 abandoned industrial complexes across 3 states. While my family paraded around country clubs, I had built a covert titan in the logistics and restoration sector, generating liquid capital that my father's pretentious commercial real estate firm could only dream of. Suddenly, my phone vibrated in the deep pocket of my faded denim jacket. The caller identification screen illuminated with a name I had not seen in months, Victoria Sinclair Hayes. I pressed the phone to my ear, keeping my eyes fixed on the welding crew above. "Hello, Victoria." "Good Lord, what is that horrendous noise?" my sister complained instantly, her nasal voice cutting sharply through the receiver. "Are you still playing in the dirt at one of your little scrapyards?" I did not defend my company. I did not explain that my little scrapyard was actually a massive, multi-state industrial empire. I simply let her condescending tone echo in the freezing air. "What do you want? Victoria?" "Don't take that tone with me," she snapped, the irritation flaring visibly in her words. "I am calling because Dad expects you at the estate for the holidays. We are hosting a highly exclusive mixer on Christmas Eve for the municipal zoning board, followed by the formal family dinner on Christmas Day. You are required to attend." I shifted my weight, my steel-toed boots grinding against the cold concrete. He hasn't invited me to a holiday dinner in 16 years. It was a simple, undeniable fact. Ever since I was a stubborn 19-year-old in 2008, I had been completely exiled from the pristine marble halls of the Sinclair estate. I had refused to fold myself into the glossy, soulless mold of my father's commercial real estate firm. I chose to build my own life with my own hands. In response, William Sinclair told me I was a pathetic failure who would eventually starve in the gutter. and he closed his heavy iron gates on me for good. It is strictly about optics, Sophie. Victoria sighed, the sound heavy with exaggerated, performative exhaustion. Dad needs to project traditional family unity for the municipal investors. Lawrence is closing a massive commercial waterfront deal, and the board wants to see a stable, unified Sinclair family. You are just a prop for the evening. Do not flatter yourself. I watched a massive steel beam swing slowly into place overhead. I kept my breathing slow and measured, digesting the name of my brother-in-law. Lawrence Hayes was a slick, sociopathic chief financial officer who wore bespoke Italian suits and viewed the world strictly through aggressive profit margins. A prop, I repeated, my voice entirely flat. Exactly, Victoria continued, completely oblivious to the cold calculation forming in my mind. So, wash the grease out of your hair. Wear a dress that is actually black, not some faded, dusty gray. Do not talk about your pathetic little restoration projects with the judges. If anyone asks, just tell them you do entry-level logistics. And for the love of God, do not drive that hideous, rusted garbage truck up the main driveway. Park it on the street. She was rattling off demands like I was a misbehaving servant. The sheer, shameless arrogance of her instructions was breathtaking. But underneath her condescending tone, I heard the faint, undeniable, frantic rhythm of her breathing. She was talking slightly too fast. She was pushing slightly too hard. William Sinclair despised me. He worshipped high society status and viewed my blue-collar existence as a genetic stain on his perfect legacy. He never did anything for the sake of family unity. He viewed human relationships strictly as leverageable assets. If he was willing to break a 16-year silence to drag the daughter he hated into a room full of elite investors, he was not looking for a heartwarming family reunion. He was desperate for a lifeline. Between Lawrence's aggressive financial leveraging and my father's desperate need to appear invincible to the public, the Sinclair empire had to be a fragile house of cards, waiting for a strong gust of wind. Are you listening to me? Sophie, Victoria demanded, her voice pitching higher into a shrill whine. Lawrence and Dad do not have the time or the patience to manage your insecurities this week. Just show up, sit quietly in the background, and make us look charitable. I did not yell. I did not hurl insults through the phone or demand an apology for a decade and a half of relentless emotional abuse. I understood the architecture of a trap better than anyone in my family, and I knew exactly how to dismantle one from the inside out. I will be there, I said, yielding absolutely nothing in my tone. Victoria let out a short, dismissive scoff. See that you are. Don't be late. The line went dead. I lowered the phone, slipping it back into the deep pocket of my jacket. The freezing December wind whipped through the broken windows of the mill, carrying the sharp scent of progress. My family believed they were summoning a naive, impoverished outcast to serve as a pawn in their high society games. They believed my silence was a symptom of complete submission. I wiped the industrial grease from my calloused hands, staring at the disconnected phone, knowing exactly what kind of trap they were setting. I pocketed my phone, the freezing December wind biting fiercely at the back of my neck. I signaled to the site foreman, tapping my wrist to authorize the next shift's overtime. Before turning away from the raining sparks of the welding crews, I navigated the labyrinth of exposed steel beams and freshly poured concrete, walking toward my temporary field office suspended on the second level of the massive textile mill. My steel-toed boots echoed heavily against the grated iron stairs, a rhythmic, grounding sound that completely drowned out the lingering echo of Victoria's shrill, condescending demands. The office was a retrofitted shipping container bolted securely into the industrial skeleton. No mahogany desks, no leather sofas, no performative luxury. It was raw, freezing, and highly functional. I pulled off my heavy leather work gloves, tossing them onto the scarred wooden drafting table, and unlocked the bottom drawer of my reinforced metal filing cabinet. I reached past the modern zoning permits and municipal blueprints, pulling out a small, weathered notebook bound in cracked black leather. I ran my thumb over the brittle spine of my 2008 diary, reflecting on the 16 grueling years of silence that had transformed a banished 19-year-old into an industrial titan. I opened the fragile, yellowed pages. The ink was faded, written with a shaky, desperate hand on the exact night William Sinclair had ordered his private security guards to escort me off his pristine, manicured estate. He had demanded I drop out of my structural engineering program to answer phones at his commercial real estate firm to serve as a pretty, compliant, silent prop for his high society mixers. When I firmly refused, he packed my bags himself. He told me blue-collar aspirations were a repulsive disease and that I would be begging on his doorstep within 6 months. I ran my calloused fingertips over the dried ink. I had not begged. I had learned to weld. I had learned to negotiate hazardous material abatement. I had built Apex Reclamation out of asbestos, sweat, and rusted iron, systematically turning abandoned, poisoned factories into state-of-the-art logistics hubs across the Midwest. Every scar on my knuckles and every ache in my spine was a testament to the fact that true, unshakable power is forged in the dirt, not inherited in a country club. A sharp, authoritative knock on the corrugated metal door broke the heavy silence of the office. The heavy door swung inward before I could answer, letting in a violent gust of freezing wind and the distant, mechanical roar of the active construction site. Gregory stepped into the field office. At 52 years old, my corporate attorney moved with the predatory, unyielding grace of a man who dismantled Fortune 500 companies for sport. He wore a tailored charcoal overcoat, though he never once complained about the thick layer of industrial dust that immediately settled on his polished Oxford shoes. He respected the dirt because he understood exactly how much capital it generated. He carried a massive, locked leather briefcase in his right hand. "The Sinclair financial audit is complete," Gregory stated, his deep baritone cutting cleanly through the ambient noise of the mill. He set the heavy briefcase onto my drafting table, entered a secure combination, and flipped the brass latches upward with 2 sharp clicks. He withdrew a thick, red-tagged dossier and slid it purposefully across the scarred wood. I closed my 2008 diary, setting the fragile piece of my past aside to confront the immediate, toxic present. I opened the heavy cover. The pages inside were a digital slaughterhouse of red ink, manipulated spreadsheets, and frantic corporate communication logs. "It is significantly worse than we initially projected," Gregory continued, pulling off his leather gloves and bracing his hands against the edge of the drafting table. "Your father's crown jewel, the commercial waterfront development, is entirely paralyzed. He failed to secure the necessary subterranean utility permits, and the municipal board officially halted all construction last Thursday. The firm is currently bleeding cash at an aggressively unsustainable velocity. They are suffocating under exactly $60 million in highly toxic, short-term debt." I stared at the classified internal ledgers Gregory had legally acquired through our network of shadow holding companies. My father projected an image of absolute, untouchable wealth to the high society elite of Chicago. He hosted lavish galas and bought Victoria $80,000 diamond necklaces to maintain the illusion of supremacy. But the paperwork beneath my calloused hands told the undeniable, pathetic truth. The Sinclair dynasty was a rotting facade, hollowed out by monumental arrogance and catastrophic mismanagement. "And Lawrence?" I asked, tracing a line of highly suspicious wire transfers highlighted in bright yellow ink. Gregory's jaw tightened, the muscles flexing visibly under his jawline. "Lawrence is panicking to avoid defaulting on their institutional margin calls. Your brother-in-law has bypassed the firm's legal protocols entirely. He is actively draining the escrow accounts of their most vulnerable investors. He is deliberately commingling client funds to artificially inflate the firm's balance sheet, buying them temporary liquidity." My eyes locked onto the offshore routing numbers. It was blatant, undeniable federal wire fraud. Lawrence was risking decades in a maximum security federal penitentiary just to keep his bespoke Italian suits and his country club memberships intact. He was stealing from innocent people to plug the holes in a sinking, fraudulent ship. "The stolen escrow funds are merely a temporary bandage," I noted, my voice remaining perfectly even despite the staggering criminality unfolding on the pages. "The institutional brokers will trigger a mandatory full audit before the end of the fiscal year. They need a massive influx of legitimate capital immediately, or they are entirely bankrupt. Gregory leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto mine with lethal intensity. They do not have the capital, Sophie. Which brings us to the sudden, highly out-of-character holiday invitation you received this morning. I looked up from the fraudulent ledgers. Victoria claimed my attendance was strictly required for family optics. She said Lawrence needed to project stability to close a municipal deal. Victoria is a useful idiot, Gregory countered coldly. William and Lawrence summoned you to the estate because Apex Reclamation officially owns 40 premium, unencumbered industrial properties across the state. They have meticulously mapped your personal assets. They desperately need hard, physical collateral to secure a predatory shadow loan from an unregulated private equity group. They intend to lock you in a room on Christmas Eve and aggressively bully you into signing over the deeds to your restoration sites. The sheer brazen audacity of their strategy crystallized in the freezing air of the field office. After 16 years of treating me like a worthless, diseased outcast, my father believed he could simply snap his fingers and summon me to his opulent estate. He believed he could verbally abuse me, mock my faded clothes, and force me to hand over the empire I had built with my own blistered hands just to save his fabricated legacy. He believed the 19-year-old girl he threw out into the cold in 2008 would still cower the exact moment he raised his voice. He had absolutely no idea that I was currently holding his federal death sentence in my grease-stained hands. The psychological compression tightened in my chest, but I did not allow a single ounce of reactive emotion to surface. I did not scream. I did not throw the dossier across the room or vent my rage at the staggering injustice of their plan. Panic and rage were weapons for weak, undisciplined people. I simply processed the mechanical architecture of their impending destruction. I closed the heavy leather dossier, instructing Gregory to quietly purchase every single defaulted bond tied to my father's sinking. Fraudulent empire. The towering wrought iron gates of the Sinclair estate swung open, welcoming me into a pristine, snow-covered monument to my father's monumental ego. My reliable, heavily rusted 2008 pickup truck grumbled loudly as the tires crunched onto the imported cobblestone driveway. The exhaust rattled, a harsh mechanical cough that violently disrupted the suffocating, engineered silence of the sprawling winter grounds. On either side of the winding path, perfectly manicured evergreen hedges stood like frozen, obedient soldiers, leading the way to the massive stone facade of the main house. Every towering window glowed with a warm, golden light, projecting a flawless illusion of generational wealth and untouchable security. I gripped the worn steering wheel, navigating the sweeping curve toward the grand portico. 3 valets dressed in crisp, tailored black uniforms stood at attention near the massive front steps as my battered truck entered the circular drop-off zone, their professional posture completely fractured. They stared at the oxidized metal wheel wells and the dented front bumper with wide, unvarnished horror, unsure if they should approach my vehicle or call estate security. I threw the heavy gear shift into park and killed the engine. The resulting silence felt thick and heavy. Before I could reach for the door handle, the towering oak double doors of the mansion swung open. Victoria stepped out onto the heated stone porch. My sister wore a pristine cream cashmere sweater, perfectly tailored designer slacks, and a heavy diamond pendant that caught the harsh glare of the portico lights. The temperature hovered just above freezing, but she did not wear a coat. She clearly intended to spend exactly 5 seconds in the elements, just enough time to assert her absolute dominance. Her eyes locked onto the hood of my truck, and her upper lip curled into a visceral, ugly sneer. She brought a manicured hand up to her face, pressing 2 fingers against her nose as if the mere sight of my vehicle emitted a foul, toxic odor. I pushed the heavy metal door open. The rusted hinges groaned loudly. I stepped out onto the cobblestones, wearing my faded, grease-stained denim jacket and scuffed steel-toed work boots. The freezing winter wind immediately bit through the worn cotton, but I kept my spine rigidly straight. "What on earth is that?" Victoria demanded, her voice shrill and echoing sharply against the stone pillars. I did not apologize for my transportation. I reached behind the driver's seat and hoisted my faded canvas duffel bag over my shoulder, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "Hello, Victoria." She did not offer a greeting. She did not step forward to embrace her sister after 16 years of bitter separation. Instead, she turned her head sharply toward the trembling lead valet. "Get this hideous garbage truck out of my sight immediately," Victoria snapped, aggressively pointing her manicured finger toward the side of the house. "Hide it behind the landscaping maintenance shed. Do not park it in the main garage. Do not park it near the service entrance. If one of the municipal judges sees this rolling trash can anywhere on this property tomorrow night, I will personally see to it that you are fired without severance. Move it." The young valet scrambled forward, his hands shaking as I calmly held out my keys. He took them without making eye contact, ducking his head in sheer embarrassment. I adjusted the canvas strap on my shoulder and walked up the wide stone steps. Victoria took a deliberate step backward, creating a visible physical barrier between her pristine cashmere and my faded denim. She looked me up and down, her eyes scanning the frayed edges of my collar and the dull, scuffed leather of my boots with absolute, unadulterated disgust. "I specifically told you to wash the grease out of your hair," she hissed, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. "You look like a homeless vagrant. You are going to be a complete embarrassment to Lawrence and Dad." I did not raise my voice. I did not point out that her husband's bespoke suits were currently funded by stolen client escrows. I allowed her to inflate her fragile ego, knowing the oxygen in her lungs was borrowed. "Where am I staying?" Victoria turned on her heel, marching back through the heavy oak doors. "Just follow me and wipe those filthy boots. Do not track mud onto the imported Persian rugs." I stepped over the threshold into the grand foyer. The air was thick with the scent of fresh pine, expensive floor wax, and wood smoke. A massive Christmas tree towered in the center of the spiraling marble staircase, dripping with thousands of hand-blown crystal ornaments that glittered like diamonds. It was a suffocating display of performative wealth, meticulously curated to intimidate anyone who walked through the front doors. I walked toward the sweeping marble steps that led to the plush, heavily renovated guest wing on the second floor. "Not up there," Victoria commanded sharply, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. I stopped, lowering my foot from the bottom marble step. I turned to face her. A cruel, malicious smile spread across her perfectly painted lips. She took a profound, visible joy in what she was about to do. She pointed a sharp fingernail toward a narrow, unlit wooden door tucked away in the shadows beneath the grand staircase. "We need the primary guest suites for the municipal investors and real estate partners arriving tomorrow," Victoria stated, dripping with manufactured sympathy that barely concealed her venom. "People who actually matter to the future of this family. We set up a space for you downstairs." She was placing me in the basement. The Sinclair Estate basement was an unfinished, subterranean concrete cavern used strictly for plumbing access and holiday decoration storage. It was damp, pitch black, and entirely uninsulated against the brutal Chicago winter. By banishing me beneath the floorboards, Victoria was actively attempting to strip away the last remaining shreds of my human dignity. She wanted me to feel like vermin, scurrying beneath the feet of her high society guests. I did not protest. I did not demand a proper bedroom or threaten to walk out the front door. The tighter they coiled the spring, the more devastating the final release would be. I adjusted my heavy canvas bag and walked toward the narrow door. I pulled it open, revealing a steep, plunging flight of wooden utility stairs. The air wafting up from the darkness was instantly, bone-chillingly cold, smelling of oxidized copper and damp earth. Victoria followed me to the threshold, looking down into the gloom with a satisfied smirk. She flipped a switch on the wall, illuminating a single, flickering fluorescent bulb at the bottom of the steps. I descended the creaking wood in silence. The basement was exactly as brutal as I remembered, thick. Exposed PVC pipes ran along the low concrete ceiling. In the far corner, nestled between a stack of cardboard boxes and a massive, humming water heater, sat a rusted iron cot. A lumpy, stained mattress rested on the metal springs, covered only by a single, scratchy gray wool blanket. There was no heating vent, no carpet, and no window. Victoria stood at the top of the stairs, her silhouette framed by the warm, golden light of the grand foyer. She crossed her arms, rubbing her cashmere sleeves as if the mere thought of the cold offended her. "It is a bit drafty down there," she called down, her voice dripping with vicious, unmistakable malice. "But beggars cannot be choosers. Sophie, you should be endlessly grateful Dad is even allowing you under his roof after you abandoned this family. Settle in quietly. Dinner is at 7, and you will eat in the kitchen with the catering staff." She did not wait for a response. She pulled the heavy wooden door shut. The sharp click of the latch echoed loudly in the concrete cavern, severing the golden light and plunging me completely into the damp, freezing shadows. The sheer, shameless cruelty of the gesture was breathtaking. My family genuinely believed that isolating me in a freezing basement would break my spirit. They thought forcing me to sleep on a lumpy mattress beneath exposed pipes would force me into total submission before they executed their extortion attempt in the study. They had absolutely no idea that the woman standing in their basement currently held the power to seize the very concrete beneath her steel-toed boots. I exhaled slowly, my breath forming a visible white cloud in the freezing air. I walked over to the rusted iron cot and dropped my faded canvas duffel bag onto the floor. I did not shed a single tear. I did not curse my sister's name or pace the concrete floor in a blind, reactive rage. I reached into the deep pocket of my denim jacket and pulled out my encrypted cell phone. The screen cast a pale, blue glow across the damp walls. I opened a secure, encrypted messaging application. A single text message waited in the inbox, sent directly from Gregory's private server exactly 3 minutes ago. Transaction complete. The first block of defaulted municipal bonds is fully secured. The Sinclair debt is officially bleeding into our holding accounts. I locked the screen, letting the darkness swallow the basement once again. I sat on the edge of the lumpy, freezing mattress in the basement, smiling quietly as my phone buzzed with the confirmation of our initial financial acquisition. The grand ballroom hummed with the suffocating scent of expensive designer cologne and the hollow, brittle laughter of Chicago's financial elite. Towering ice sculptures depicting the Sinclair corporate crest slowly melted onto massive silver platters of imported oysters. A live string quartet, tucked into the far corner of the room, played a classical waltz, though the delicate music was entirely drowned out by the aggressive, performative networking of municipal judges, zoning board directors, and private equity investors. The entire space was meticulously engineered to project an aura of infinite, untouchable generational wealth. I stood near the cold perimeter of the room, attempting to blend into the heavy crimson velvet drapes. I was wearing a shapeless, severely faded black dress with a rigid, choking white collar and stiff white cuffs. An entirely unnecessary, bright white half-apron was tied tightly around my waist. The hem was uneven, the cheap polyester scratching aggressively against my calves, and the shoulders were cut so tight that they restricted my breathing. It was, by every metric of historical fashion, an outdated, humiliating maid's uniform. 3 hours earlier, the heavy wooden door at the top of the basement stairs had creaked open. Victoria had marched halfway down the steep wooden steps, holding her cashmere sweater tight against her chest as if the basement air might infect her. She had tossed a plastic-wrapped bundle onto the freezing concrete floor directly at my steel-toed boots. "You absolutely cannot wear faded denim around the zoning board directors tonight," she had sneered, pinching the bridge of her nose in exaggerated disgust. "Put this on. It belonged to the estate's housekeeping staff back in the 1990s. Stand in the corner, keep your mouth shut, and try to blend in with the catering staff so no one asks any embarrassing questions about your bloodline. You are here to make us look charitable. Sophie, do not ruin this for Lawrence." I had picked the plastic bundle up off the damp concrete without offering a single word of protest. Now, observing the lavish party from my isolated corner, I watched Lawrence Hayes command the exact center of the ballroom. My brother-in-law wore a bespoke, midnight blue Italian suit that draped flawlessly across his shoulders. A heavy gold watch gleamed on his left wrist as he aggressively swiped the air with his hands, telling an animated, highly exaggerated story to a circle of captivated local politicians. A frantic catering manager in a tight black tuxedo approached Lawrence from behind, holding a portable electronic payment terminal and a thick leather-bound invoice. I watched Lawrence's jaw tighten a microscopic, involuntary twitch of pure panic that cracked his arrogant facade for a fraction of a second. Lawrence pulled a heavy black corporate credit card from his tailored breast pocket and slapped it onto the terminal with excessive, theatrical force. He was actively authorizing an emergency, mid-party resupply of imported vintage champagne and beluga caviar to ensure the municipal judges remained thoroughly intoxicated. The digital terminal processed the magnetic stripe. The screen buffered. Lawrence's shoulders went entirely rigid. He stopped breathing, his eyes locked dead on the small plastic machine. A sharp, approving beep echoed from the terminal. Lawrence exhaled a long, shaky breath. He smiled a slick, predatory stretching of his lips at the catering manager, but his trembling fingers lingered on the plastic card for a second too long before shoving it back into his pocket. He was spending $40,000 on fermented grape juice to impress municipal officials, and I knew exactly whose money he was burning to do it. The black card was tethered directly to the Kensington Luxury Estates corporate treasury. I had reviewed the classified digital ledgers with Gregory just hours ago in my freezing field office. Lawrence was actively draining the escrow accounts of vulnerable, elderly clients to fund the performative consumption happening in this very room. He was committing federal wire fraud right in front of the municipal judges he was trying to bribe. Lawrence turned back to his audience, raising his newly acquired crystal flute of champagne high into the air. "Our fourth quarter profit margins are absolutely unprecedented," he boasted, his voice projecting loudly enough to ensure the entire eastern wing of the ballroom heard him. "Kensington Luxury Estates is operating with maximum liquid capital. We are currently finalizing a massive waterfront acquisition that will completely redefine the municipal skyline of this city. The market simply bends to our will because we leverage absolute untouchable assets. We do not just build commercial properties, we build immortal legacies." The circle of politicians nodded sycophantically, raising their own glasses in blind reverence to a man who was mathematically bankrupt. Victoria glided across the polished marble floor, linking her arms smoothly through her husband's. She leaned into his shoulder, whispering something into his ear. She turned her head, spotting me standing silently in the shadows of the velvet drapes. Her eyes lit up with a vicious, malicious glee. She tapped Lawrence's chest, nodding in my direction. Lawrence chuckled, a cruel, throaty sound that vibrated with manufactured superiority. He motioned for one of the oldest, most influential municipal judges to follow them as they marched directly across the ballroom floor toward my isolated corner. "Judge Miller," Victoria purred, gesturing toward me with her crystal flute. "I want to introduce you to our extended family charity case. This is my sister, Sophie." The older judge blinked, taking in my rigid white collar, the cheap, shapeless black fabric hanging off my frame, and the stark white apron tied around my waist. He visibly recoiled. "Oh," he muttered, shifting uncomfortably in his tailored tuxedo. "A pleasure, Sophie. Do you also work in the high-end commercial real estate sector with your father?" "Goodness, no." Victoria laughed, a shrill, piercing sound that cut sharply through the surrounding conversations. "Sophie plays in the dirt. She runs a little trash collection service in the industrial district. Scrap metal, hauling garbage, sorting through rusted junk that's sort of gritty, unfortunate labor. She isn't exactly corporate material. We try to bring her out of the slums for the holidays so she remembers what civilized society actually looks like." Lawrence stepped closer, aggressively invading my personal space. The scent of his overpowering designer cologne mixed heavily with the sour, metallic tang of the nervous sweat he was desperately trying to conceal beneath his bespoke suit. "It is a necessary lesson in humility for her, Judge," Lawrence added, his eyes narrowing into cold, predatory slits as he stared down at me. "She handles the refuse of the city, and we handle the skyline. It is the natural order of things. Everyone has their proper place in the food chain, and Sophie's place is at the very bottom." Lawrence held out his empty crystal flute. He pressed the cold, condensation-slick glass directly against my chest, pushing it forward until I was physically forced to raise my hands and take it from him. "Be a dear, Sophie, and fetch us another round of vintage from the kitchen," Lawrence commanded, his tone completely blurring the line between a family member and a hired servant. "And wipe that grimace off your face while you do it. You are incredibly lucky we even allow you to stand in the same room as our investors." Judge Miller offered a strained, polite chuckle, clearly mortified by the blatant domestic humiliation but far too reliant on the Sinclair firm's perceived wealth to object to their cruelty. I did not throw the crystal flute to the floor. I did not scream at Victoria for forcing me into a housekeeper's uniform, nor did I expose Lawrence's federal wire fraud to the municipal judge standing 3 feet away. I simply wrapped my calloused fingers around the delicate stem of the empty glass. I looked at the heavy beads of sweat forming along Lawrence's hairline. I looked at the frantic, desperate need for validation burning in Victoria's eyes. They were suffocating under the crushing weight of their own fabricated empire, actively lashing out at me to artificially inflate their collapsing egos. I lowered my head in a slow, deliberate nod of absolute compliance, satisfied that they had successfully asserted their dominance. Victoria and Lawrence turned their backs on me. They guided the judge back toward the center of the glittering room, laughing loudly at my silence as definitive proof of my absolute submissiveness. I did not move toward the catering kitchen. I remained perfectly still in the shadows, feeling the cold glass in my hand. I stood silently against the marble pillar, letting them mock the faded dress on my back while I securely held the deed to the roof over their heads. The heavy oak doors of my father's study clicked shut, sealing me inside the very room where he executed his most ruthless domestic bullying. It was past 1 in the morning. The final municipal judges and private equity investors had departed the estate in a flurry of valet tickets and slurred holiday well-wishes. The grand ballroom outside was silent, left to the catering staff sweeping up shattered crystal and discarded napkins. But inside the mahogany-lined study, the atmosphere was thick, suffocating, and charged with a frantic, electrified panic. My father sat behind his massive, custom-built desk, leaning back into his tufted leather chair. He held a crystal tumbler filled with expensive scotch, the ice clinking sharply against the glass as his fingers tapped a rapid, uneven rhythm against the rim. He had loosened his silk tie, and the top button of his tailored dress shirt was undone. The polished, aristocratic patriarch who had smoothly charmed the city's elite just an hour ago was completely gone. In his place sat a cornered, aging man, radiating absolute desperation. Lawrence paced the length of the Persian rug. My brother-in-law had stripped off his bespoke suit jacket, rolling up his sleeves to reveal skin slick with a heavy, sour sweat. He ran a trembling hand through his meticulously styled hair, destroying the perfect part. He marched over to my father's desk, picked up a thick, leather-bound portfolio, and spun around to face me. I stood exactly where they had directed me in the center of the room, still wearing the shapeless, humiliating black maid's uniform and the stiff white apron. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my hands clasped loosely in front of me. Lawrence slapped the heavy portfolio down onto the edge of the mahogany desk. He flipped the cover open and aggressively pushed a thick stack of legal documents across the polished wood, stopping them just inches from my waist. He pulled a silver fountain pen from his pocket and dropped it directly on top of the paper. "We are executing a highly complex, multi-tiered financial maneuver tomorrow morning," Lawrence began, his voice pitching higher than usual, vibrating with a frantic, uncoordinated energy. "Kensington Luxury Estates is securing a bridge loan to finalize our waterfront development. The institutional lenders require immediate, physical collateral to underwrite the capital transfer." He leaned forward, pressing his knuckles flat against the desk. His breath came in shallow, rapid bursts. "We know you own the deeds to those rusted, pathetic little scrapyards out in the industrial district." Lawrence sneered, though his eyes darted nervously between my face and the contract. "The valuation is practically worthless, but the raw acreage is sufficient for the shadow lenders to check their compliance boxes. You are going to sign these transfer documents right now. You are assigning the total equity and physical deeds of Apex Reclamation over to our corporate holding firm." I did not reach for the silver pen. I lowered my eyes to the heavy, premium cardstock. Even upside down, The dense legal jargon was unmistakable. It was an unconditional surrender of my entire corporate infrastructure. They were demanding I hand over the empire I had built over 16 grueling years, every restored textile mill, every logistics hub, every environmental permit so they could pledge it against a predatory shadow loan. They needed $60 million to cover the catastrophic margin call Lawrence had triggered. They expected me to sacrifice my entire existence to plug the massive, bleeding hole in their fraudulent ship. I looked up from the documents, meeting Lawrence's bloodshot eyes. I cannot authorize the transfer of my corporate assets. Lawrence, I stated, my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of anger or hesitation. The answer is no. Lawrence stopped breathing. His jaw dropped slightly, his mouth hanging open in absolute shock. He had genuinely expected the 19-year-old girl they banished a decade and a half ago to simply bow her head, pick up the pen, and surrender. "You do not have a choice, Sophie," Lawrence snapped, his voice cracking violently into a pathetic wheeze. He slammed his fist against the mahogany wood, the impact rattling my father's Scotch glass. "You owe this family. We put a roof over your head tonight. We let you stand in the same room as our investors. You are going to sign that paper. Or I swear to God." "Enough, Lawrence." My father's voice cut through the study like a swinging blade. He set his crystal tumbler down on a leather coaster with a heavy, definitive thud. He pushed his chair back and stood up slowly. William Sinclair walked around the edge of the massive desk, stopping less than 2 feet in front of me. The scent of aged bourbon and stale cigar smoke washed over me. He looked at the stiff white apron tied around my waist, his upper lip curling into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. "You have always been an ungrateful, stubborn parasite," my father hissed, dropping the patrician mask entirely. The veins in his neck bulged against his skin, pulsing rapidly with rising fury. "I gave you the Sinclair name. I offered you a place in a civilized, high-society firm, and you spat in my face to go play in the dirt with common laborers. Now, when your bloodline requires a minor, insignificant sacrifice to secure our legacy, you dare to stand in my study and refuse me?" I did not flinch. I did not step back to yield my physical space. I maintained eye contact, watching his face flush a deep, mottled red. When he realized his intimidation tactics were failing to produce a single tremor of fear, my father crossed a moral boundary so abhorrent it permanently severed whatever microscopic tether of humanity still existed between us. He leaned in closer, dropping his voice into a vicious, predatory whisper. "Your grandmother is currently residing in the private memory care wing of the Municipal Medical Center," my father stated, his eyes narrowing into cold. "Calculating slits. I hold her medical power of attorney. I pay the exorbitant facility fees to ensure she receives specialized, round-the-clock dementia care. If you do not pick up that silver pen and sign over those garbage dumps right this second, I will sever her funding tomorrow morning." The air in the study went entirely still. Lawrence wiped his sweaty forehead, watching the extortion unfold with sick, desperate approval. "I will revoke your visitation rights entirely," my father continued, a sadistic, cruel smile stretching across his red face. "You will never see her again. I will have her transferred to a severely underfunded, bare-bones state ward by the end of the week. She will spend her final years decaying in a cramped, sterile room, surrounded by strangers, completely stripped of her dignity. And when she calls out your name in confusion, you will not be there." He reached behind him, picking up the silver fountain pen. He thrust it forcefully against my chest. "Sign the contract, Sophie," my father ordered, his chest heaving with arrogant triumph, "or I will make sure the only family member who ever actually loved you dies completely alone." The absolute depravity of his threat hung heavily in the suffocating air of the study. He was weaponizing a fragile, elderly woman suffering from cognitive decline to secure commercial collateral for a fraudulent real estate firm. He was willing to subject his own mother-in-law to unimaginable neglect and terror just to avoid a margin call. I looked at the silver pen pressed against my collarbone. I looked at the dark, pulsing vein on my father's forehead. I looked at Lawrence, who was practically vibrating with desperate anticipation in the background. I did not scream. I did not knock the pen from his hand or launch into a defensive, weeping plea for mercy. Panic is a tool for the powerless, and I was holding the absolute authority to level their entire universe. They were threatening me with a weapon that possessed no ammunition, utterly oblivious to the fact that Gregory had already quietly secured my grandmother's medical trust months ago. My father's legal leverage over her care was entirely fabricated, a ghost of a power he lost the moment he stopped paying attention to the fine print. But the sheer intent behind his words, the willingness to inflict that specific, agonizing brand of cruelty upon an innocent woman, cemented my resolve into impenetrable steel. There would be no mercy. There would be no partial settlements or quiet bankruptcies. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire existence until there was nothing left but dust. I did not reach for the pen. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, allowing the silver instrument to fall from my chest and clatter loudly onto the hardwood floor. I looked my father dead in the eyes, stripping away every ounce of daughterly submission, leaving only the clinical, calculating gaze of an apex predator analyzing its trapped prey. I turned my back on his red, furious face. I walked slowly toward the heavy oak doors, my rubber-soled boots making no sound against the Persian rug. Behind me, my father began to shout, his voice echoing violently against the mahogany walls, cursing my name and promising absolute, unmitigated destruction. I walked out of the room without raising my voice, knowing the unsigned contract left on his desk was the final nail in their corporate coffin. Arrogance always breeds absolute desperation, and by the next morning, Lawrence's panic had mutated into a spectacular federal crime. The basement of the Sinclair estate offered no reprieve from the biting Chicago winter. At 5 a.m, the damp concrete walls radiated a bone-deep chill that completely bypassed the thin, scratchy wool blanket Victoria had provided. I did not waste energy attempting to sleep on the rusted iron springs. I abandoned the lumpy mattress, pulled my faded denim jacket tightly over my shoulders, and climbed the steep, creaking wooden utility stairs. The sprawling estate kitchen was already a theater of highly orchestrated chaos. A team of private caterers in crisp white uniforms rushed between the massive brushed steel refrigerators and the commercial ovens, preparing for the opulent Christmas dinner scheduled for that evening. The air was thick with the scent of roasted garlic, fresh rosemary, and melting butter, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of oxidized copper I had breathed all night. I poured myself a mug of black coffee from a modest side station and retreated to a quiet corner near the floor-to-ceiling frosted windows, staying entirely out of the catering staff's frantic path. At exactly 9 a.m, the swinging wooden doors of the kitchen pushed open. Lawrence marched into the room. My brother-in-law wore a heavy, cream-colored cashmere sweater and sharply tailored trousers, projecting the image of relaxed, holiday luxury. But the pristine edges of his grooming were severely fraying. Deep, bruised shadows hung heavily beneath his bloodshot eyes. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles twitched erratically beneath his skin. He moved with a stiff, uncoordinated mechanical rigidity, looking less like a master of the financial universe and more like a hunted animal desperately searching for an exit. He bypassed the elaborate breakfast spread the caterers had prepared. He ignored the fresh pastries and the expensive espresso machine, marching directly toward the crystal decanters lined up on the mahogany wet bar tucked into the far corner of the sprawling kitchen. It was Christmas morning, yet Lawrence aggressively unstoppered a heavy glass decanter. He poured a massive measure of amber liquid into a crystal tumbler. The ice clinked violently against the glass, betraying the severe, uncontrollable tremor shaking his right hand. He took a long, desperate swallow, wincing slightly as the alcohol burned down his throat. He lowered the glass, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, and turned his head. His bloodshot eyes locked onto me standing quietly by the frosted window. A cruel, malicious smirk slowly stretched across his pale face. The raw panic radiating from his posture was instantly buried beneath a thick, manufactured layer of sociopathic arrogance. He took another sip of his drink and closed the distance between us, his expensive leather slippers slapping softly against the polished marble floor. "You think you are incredibly clever, don't you, Sophie?" Lawrence sneered. Stopping just on the other side of the marble prep island, the sharp, overpowering scent of his designer cologne clashed violently with the stale, sour odor of the alcohol on his breath. "You thought you won a massive victory last night. You thought dropping that silver pen and walking out of the study made you untouchable." I took a slow sip of my black coffee. I did not offer a single syllable in response. Lawrence rested his knuckles on the cold marble, leaning his body weight forward. "That is the fundamental problem with people who play in the dirt," he whispered, his tone dripping with elitist venom. "You do not understand how real power operates. You think saying no is a magic shield. You think hiding behind your stubborn, blue-collar pride protects your pathetic little assets." He reached into the pocket of his tailored trousers and pulled out his sleek, encrypted smartphone. He tapped the screen rapidly with his thumb, his eyes darting frantically over the illuminated glass before locking back onto my face. "The commercial real estate market does not stop for ungrateful, stubborn little girls," Lawrence continued, his voice vibrating with a frantic, unearned superiority. "When a firm like Kensington Luxury Estates requires collateral to bridge a $60 million capital transfer, we do not simply take no for an answer. We find alternate solutions. We bypass the roadblocks." He swirled his glass, the ice clinking a steady, chaotic rhythm. "Paperwork is just paper, Sophie," he mocked, leaning closer. "Deeds, titles, equity transfers. They have a highly convenient way of sorting themselves out when the people holding them are far too stupid to understand their value. You cannot protect what you cannot secure." The sheer, brazen idiocy of his taunt hung heavily in the warm kitchen air. Lawrence had spent the entire night suffocating under the reality of his catastrophic margin call. Driven entirely by the absolute terror of impending bankruptcy and federal prison, he had chosen the most desperate, reckless path available. He assumed my corporate headquarters was nothing more than a rusted shipping container sitting in an abandoned dirt lot, secured by a cheap brass padlock. He believed that because I wore faded denim and steel-toed boots, I was too impoverished to afford basic structural security. He had hired unlicensed, off-the-books thugs to drive out to my remote industrial site on a holiday morning. He had instructed them to physically break into my field office, tear open my filing cabinets, and steal the physical property deeds to Apex Reclamation. He planned to forge my signature on the transfer documents he had presented in the study, using the stolen deeds to collateralize his predatory shadow loan before the institutional auditors arrived next week. He was standing in a warm, marble kitchen, drinking expensive scotch, and actively confessing to the orchestration of a massive corporate burglary. Deep inside the pocket of my denim jacket, my encrypted cell phone vibrated. It was not a standard notification. It was a precise, rhythmic sequence. 3 short bursts of vibration, followed by a long, sustained pulse. My heart beat a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. I knew exactly what that specific vibration pattern meant. The exterior biometric perimeter alarm at the textile mill had just been breached. I kept my eyes locked on Lawrence's sweating, arrogant face, visualizing the exact sequence of events unfolding 30 miles away. His hired thugs were likely using heavy steel crowbars against the corrugated metal door of my retrofitted office. They had absolutely no idea that the shipping container was structurally reinforced with industrial-grade titanium plating. They did not know that the moment their crowbars struck the metal frame, high-definition, night vision surveillance cameras embedded in the steel rafters had silently powered on. My phone vibrated again, 2 short pulses. The interior motion sensors were active. They had managed to pry the door open. They were currently standing inside my office, completely oblivious to the fact that every single movement, every whispered command, and every facial feature was being recorded in crystal-clear digital formatting and instantly uploaded to Gregory's highly secure, off-site servers. Lawrence's hired men were aggressively rummaging through decoy filing cabinets filled with outdated zoning permits, leaving a pristine trail of physical and digital evidence. Lawrence took another long, greedy swallow of his drink, relishing my absolute silence. He interpreted my stoic posture as paralyzing fear. He genuinely believed his psychological warfare was breaking me down. "You should have just signed the contract last night." "Sophie," Lawrence whispered, tapping his phone against the marble counter with a smug, victorious rhythm. "It would have saved you a tremendous amount of heartache. But do not worry. I am a highly proactive financial officer. I always take care of the heavy lifting. By the time the grand dinner concludes tonight, your little scrapyards will officially belong to the Sinclair empire, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop it." He flashed a predatory, sociopathic smile. Thoroughly convinced of his own unmatched genius, he turned his back on me, marching confidently back toward the mahogany wet bar to celebrate his fabricated triumph. I lowered my coffee mug, feeling the cold, heavy weight of the phone resting in my pocket. I did not raise my voice. I did not shatter his pathetic illusion or warn him about the inescapable concrete cage he had just locked himself inside. I simply watched the chief financial officer of Kensington Luxury Estates secure his own federal indictment. He poured himself another glass of vintage scotch, completely oblivious to the fact that his hired thugs had just triggered a silent, encrypted alarm. Sitting in the freezing cab of my truck that exact same afternoon, I opened my encrypted laptop to review the catastrophic mistake he had just made. My heavy, rusted pickup remained exactly where Victoria had ordered the valets to banish it yesterday, tucked away behind the sprawling, cedar-paneled landscaping maintenance shed on the far eastern edge of the estate. The dense evergreen hedges shielded the vehicle completely from the main driveway and the sweeping floor-to-ceiling windows of the mansion. The isolation provided the perfect blind spot. The temperature outside had plummeted well below freezing, casting a thick, jagged layer of frost across the windshield. My breath plumed into thick white clouds in the freezing cab, but I did not turn the engine over to run the heater. I required absolute silence. I rested the heavy, industrial-grade laptop across the center console. I brushed a layer of condensation from the cold metal chassis and pressed the power button. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh, pale blue glow across the cracked vinyl dashboard and my heavily calloused hands. I bypassed the standard operating system, utilizing a biometric thumb scan followed by a 16-character alphanumeric sequence to access my private, off-site server. The digital interface populated with a grid of high-definition surveillance feeds transmitting directly from my remote restoration site. I tapped the touchpad, isolating the central exterior and interior cameras mounted around my retrofitted shipping container office. I navigated to the archived footage, dialing the timestamp back to exactly 9 o'clock that morning, the precise moment Lawrence had stood in the warm marble kitchen, drinking vintage scotch and boasting about his unbeatable financial intellect. I pressed play. The high-definition video fed seamlessly across my screen. An unmarked, mud-splattered black sport utility vehicle pulled aggressively onto the dirt lot of my industrial site. Two large men wearing heavy canvas winter coats and thick tactical boots stepped out into the biting wind. They moved with a rigid, hurried urgency, constantly checking their surroundings. They marched directly up the iron-grated stairs toward my field office, pulling two heavy steel crowbars from beneath their coats. They did not wear masks. They assumed they were breaking into a deserted, unguarded scrapyard completely devoid of modern technology. Their bare faces were captured in crystal clear 4K resolution by the discrete lens embedded in the exterior security floodlight. The lead thug wedged the flattened end of his crowbar into the seam of the corrugated metal door. He threw his entire body weight backward, expecting the cheap lock to snap instantly. The heavy directional microphone mounted under the eaves picked up the sharp, grinding scrape of steel against steel. The door did not yield a single inch. The thug grunted, readjusting his grip and striking the metal frame aggressively. I watched their visible frustration mount as they spent the next 12 minutes desperately trying to pry open a door that was secretly reinforced with industrial-grade titanium plating. Finally, utilizing a heavy sledgehammer retrieved from their vehicle, They managed to batter the locking mechanism enough to force the door inward, the interior cameras, concealed seamlessly within the exposed steel rafters of the ceiling, engaged the moment the threshold was breached. The two men stepped into my office, their heavy boots tracking dark winter mud across the scarred wooden floorboards. They began tearing the room apart with reckless abandon. They ripped the architectural blueprints off my drafting table, scattering the heavy paper across the room. They yanked the drawers out of my primary desk, dumping pens, staple guns, and loose hardware onto the ground. Then, the second man spotted the metal filing cabinet tucked into the far corner. It was locked with a heavy, cheap brass padlock. This was the exact visual bait I had laid out months ago for low-level industrial thieves. Lawrence had assumed my lack of high society polish equated to a lack of basic operational security. He believed I kept the multi-million-dollar property deeds to my entire corporate infrastructure, sitting in a tin box secured by a $20 lock. The first man raised his crowbar and brought it down violently against the brass padlock. The lock shattered on the second strike, clattering uselessly to the floor. The man yanked the heavy metal drawer open. Inside sat 3 thick, manila folders stamped with the word deeds in bold black ink. The man pulled the folders out, flipping them open to expose the thick, premium legal cardstock inside. A wide, victorious smile stretched across his scarred face. He held the documents up, tapping the heavy paper with his thick finger. The trap had closed completely. They were holding flawlessly forged, entirely useless decoy documents I kept specifically for corporate espionage attempts. But Lawrence's hired muscle was not finished digging their employer's grave. The second man reached into the interior pocket of his heavy canvas coat and pulled out a sleek, modern smartphone. He tapped the screen, raising the device to his ear. The high-definition audio feed captured the quiet, hollow ringing tones echoing in the small office. A click sounded over the microphone. The thug pressed a button on the screen, switching the call to speakerphone to allow his partner to hear. "We are in," the thug announced, his gruff voice vibrating cleanly through the speakers of my laptop. "We popped the lock. We have the property deeds." The audio feed picked up the sharp, unmistakable sound of ice clinking against crystal on the other end of the line. "Excellent," Lawrence's voice responded, distorted slightly by the cellular compression but entirely, undeniably recognizable. "Secure the documents and leave the site immediately. Bring them directly to the drop location. I need those signatures forged before the municipal judges arrive for the Christmas dinner tonight." "Understood, Hayes," the thug replied, explicitly confirming his employer's identity on a federally recorded surveillance feed. "We are heading back now." The call disconnected. The two men shoved the decoy folders inside their coats and sprinted out of the office, leaving the metal door swinging on its battered hinges. I pressed the spacebar on my laptop, pausing the surveillance feed. The image froze on the clear, high-definition profile of the hired man holding his cell phone, sealing the undeniable link between the physical break-in and the chief financial officer of Kensington Luxury Estates. I did not gasp. I did not pump my fist in victory or smile at the glowing screen. I remained perfectly still in the freezing cab of my truck, watching my breath fog in the bitter air. Lawrence had just documented his own corporate extortion, wire fraud, and burglary on a secure digital server. He had handed me the absolute authority to dismantle his entire existence, and he had done it all while drinking my father's scotch and insulting my intelligence. I minimized the video player and opened my encrypted email client. I attached the compressed video files, the isolated audio tracks, the biometric access logs, and the explicit timestamp metadata. I addressed the secure transmission to Gregory's direct legal server. I typed a brief, single-line message in the body of the email. "The physical breach is verified. Execute the federal warrants for tonight." I hit the send button. A green progress bar illuminated the screen, rapidly filling from left to right. The digital packet soared through the encrypted network, completely bypassing the opulent, performative wealth of the estates surrounding me. Outside the frosted windows of my truck, the pale winter sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, dark shadows across the snow-covered grounds. The sprawling mansion lit up against the twilight. Bright, golden light poured from the towering ballroom windows. I could see the silhouettes of catering staff moving frantically, preparing the massive dining tables for the grand Christmas dinner. The municipal judges, the wealthy local politicians, and the elite investors would be arriving within the hour. My father and my brother-in-law were currently upstairs in their plush, heated suites, buttoning their bespoke tuxedos and straightening their silk ties. They were preparing to hold court, expecting to publicly humiliate me one final time before using my stolen assets to save their fraudulent empire. They believed the coiled spring was completely under their control. The green progress bar on my laptop hit 100%. A quiet, hollow chime echoed in the cab of the truck. I closed the heavy metal lid of the laptop, sealing the screen and plunging the cab back into total, freezing darkness. I slipped the computer into my faded canvas bag, zipped it shut, and reached for the rusted door handle. I stepped out into the biting winter wind, fully prepared to return to the freezing basement, tie that humiliating white apron around my waist, and serve them their final meal. I forwarded the crystal-clear surveillance files to Gregory, the digital transmission officially finalizing Lawrence's impending federal prison sentence. The crystal chandeliers cast a harsh, unforgiving light over a dining table, set perfectly for a high society slaughter. 30 of Chicago's most influential municipal judges, zoning board directors, and private equity investors took their seats along the sprawling, custom-built mahogany table. The surface was a meticulous landscape of heavy silver cutlery, towering floral arrangements of white winter roses, and crystal water goblets that caught the overhead light like scattered diamonds. The air was thick with the scent of roasted duck, black truffles, and the heavy, suffocating weight of performative wealth. William Sinclair assumed his position at the absolute head of the table. He sat in a high-backed leather chair that resembled a throne, adjusting the lapels of his bespoke black tuxedo. He surveyed the room with the arrogant satisfaction of a monarch ruling over a compliant kingdom. I was placed at the exact opposite end of the room. My assigned seat was a small, rigid wooden chair positioned inches from the swinging wooden doors of the catering kitchen. Every time a waiter rushed past, a sharp draft of cold air whipped across my shoulders. I was still wearing the shapeless, faded black maid's uniform and the stiff white half-apron Victoria had forced upon me the previous night. The cheap polyester scratched against my skin, a stark, deliberate visual contrast to the silk gowns and tailored Italian suits surrounding me. I was intentionally positioned as a human boundary line, separating the elite guests from the hired help. To my father's immediate right sat Lawrence. My brother-in-law had entirely shed the frantic, sweating panic that had consumed him in the kitchen just hours earlier. He slouched back comfortably in his chair, swirling a glass of vintage red wine. He pulled his sleek smartphone from his breast pocket, tapping the screen to illuminate the display. A slow, deeply satisfied smirk stretched across his face. He leaned over, shielding his mouth with his hand, and whispered something directly into my father's ear. William's posture instantly shifted. The tight, rigid tension that had gripped his jaw for the past 2 days completely evaporated. He let out a low, rumbling chuckle and patted Lawrence firmly on the shoulder. They genuinely believed the operation was a complete success. Lawrence had received confirmation from his hired thugs. He thought the physical property deeds to Apex Reclamation were currently sitting securely in his briefcase, completely unaware that he possessed nothing but worthless decoy folders. He believed the forged signatures would clear the institutional auditors on Monday morning, collateralizing his $60 million shadow loan and erasing his massive federal wire fraud. Operating under the absolute delusion of invincibility, William tapped his silver fork against his crystal wine glass. The sharp, piercing chimes instantly silenced the low hum of conversation around the table. "To our esteemed guests," my father began, projecting his deep, commanding voice across the length of the dining room. He raised his glass high into the air. "We gather tonight to celebrate the close of a highly prosperous year. Kensington Luxury Estates continues to dominate the commercial skyline because we do not rely on luck. We rely on the superior intellect, the unwavering discipline, and the absolute pedigree of this family. The 30 elite guests nodded in sycophantic agreement, murmuring their approval as they raised their own glasses. In an industry where weaker firms crumble under market pressure, we thrive, William boasted, his chest puffing outward against his tailored shirt. We possess the liquid capital to weather any storm and the vision to transform raw dirt into immortal, high society legacies, to the continued supremacy of our endeavors. To supremacy, Lawrence echoed loudly, flashing a predatory, arrogant smile as he drank from his glass. I kept my eyes locked on the table, watching the dark reflection of the chandelier in my empty water goblet. The sheer density of their delusion compressed the air in the room. They were drinking expensive wine and bragging about their liquid capital, completely oblivious to the fact that their digital ledgers were bleeding out. Victoria, seated across from her husband, basked in the collective admiration of the room, but her fragile ego required constant, visible validation. She could not simply enjoy the dinner. She needed a target to elevate her own status. Her eyes darted down the length of the table, locking onto my stiff white collar and faded black dress. "The catering staff is moving incredibly slow tonight," Victoria announced, her shrill voice cutting sharply through the polite dinner conversation. She sighed, touching the heavy diamond pendant resting against her collarbone in a gesture of exaggerated exhaustion. She snapped her manicured fingers in my direction. The sharp, cracking sound drew the immediate attention of the municipal judges seated near her. "Sophie, do make yourself useful," Victoria commanded, waving her hand dismissively toward a massive silver platter resting on a side table near my chair. "Bring the beluga caviar canapes down to this end of the table. We cannot be expected to wait all evening while you just sit there taking up space." The conversation around the table abruptly halted. The municipal officials and private investors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They were witnessing a blatant, deeply uncomfortable display of domestic humiliation, but their reliance on the Sinclair firm's perceived wealth kept their mouths firmly shut. No one offered a word of defense. No one told Victoria her behavior was inappropriate. I did not glare at my sister. I did not throw my napkin onto the table or raise my voice to refuse the degrading command. The psychological compression was reaching a suffocating, critical mass. If I reacted with anger, I would give them exactly what they wanted, the image of a bitter, unstable, blue-collar failure ruining their elegant dinner. I pushed my rigid wooden chair back. The wooden legs scraped softly against the marble floor. I stood up, smoothing the front of the stiff white apron. I walked over to the side table and gripped the handles of the heavy silver platter. The cold metal pressed against the thick, calloused skin of my palms. I turned and began the long, slow walk down the length of the sprawling dining table. Every pair of eyes in the room tracked my movement. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, heavy tread of my rubber-soled boots against the polished stone. I stopped beside the oldest municipal judge, lowering the heavy silver tray so he could reach the delicate appetizers. He kept his eyes averted, staring firmly at the white linen tablecloth as he nervously picked up a small toast point. He was entirely complicit in my humiliation, trading his basic human decency for a seat at my father's table. I moved to Victoria. She did not even look at the tray. She looked directly at my face, her eyes burning with a vicious, triumphant malice. She selected a canapé with a slow, exaggerated elegance, relishing the visual of her older sister performing manual labor for her amusement. I stepped over to Lawrence. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at the white apron tied around my waist, his upper lip curling into a sneer of pure, sociopathic disgust. "Careful, Sophie," Lawrence whispered, keeping his voice just low enough that only the immediate guests could hear. "Do not get your industrial grease on the silver. These platters are worth more than your entire annual salary," he chuckled, reaching out to take an appetizer. My father watched the entire exchange from the head of the table. He smiled, a cold, approving expression that validated every ounce of cruelty his son-in-law and daughter had just inflicted. "You must forgive my eldest daughter, ladies and gentlemen," William announced, addressing the room with a tone of manufactured, patronizing sympathy. She lacks the fundamental intellect required to operate in high society circles. Some people are simply born to play in the dirt, entirely content to scrape the bottom of the barrel. It is a burden this family has learned to carry with grace. The room erupted in a chorus of polite, sycophantic laughter. The municipal judges and private investors chuckled at my expense, eager to align themselves with the patriarch's vicious sense of humor. I pulled the silver tray back, my spine perfectly straight. I did not yield a single inch of my composure. I turned my back on my father's arrogant, red face and walked the long distance back to the far end of the dining room. I set the heavy platter down on the side table. The physical weight left my hands, replaced entirely by the cold, heavy realization that the trap was perfectly set. I sat back down in the rigid wooden chair, feeling the sharp draft of cold air from the kitchen doors wash over my neck. I reached my right hand under the table, brushing my thumb against the faded fabric of my pocket where my encrypted cell phone rested in absolute silence. I kept my calloused hands folded quietly in my lap as the room laughed at my expense, waiting patiently for the heavy pendulum of karma to swing. The density of their cruelty thickened the freezing air, turning the opulent dining room into a suffocating chamber of elitist venom. The sycophantic chuckles from the initial barrage of insults faded slowly into the rhythmic clatter of heavy silver knives cutting into roasted duck, accompanied by the soft, crystal ring of wine glasses being set upon crisp, white linen tablecloths. The 30 municipal officials and corporate investors refocused their attention on their expensive plates, eager to ignore the blatant domestic abuse they had just endorsed with their laughter. I remained perfectly still on my rigid wooden chair, the stiff white collar of the maid's uniform scratched relentlessly against my throat, and the cheap polyester restricted my breathing. Every time a waiter burst through the swinging kitchen doors behind me to clear an empty appetizer plate, a sharp gust of frigid air hit the back of my neck. I was forced to lean forward, pressing my elbows tightly against my ribs, just to prevent the heavy wooden doors from slamming into my spine. I was a human obstacle, an afterthought positioned directly in the crossfire of the catering staff. Victoria took a small, delicate bite of her meal, chewing slowly as she dragged her gaze back down the long table toward my end of the room. She carefully placed her silver fork across her pristine china plate, leaning forward to ensure the harsh chandelier light caught the heavy diamond pendant resting against her collarbone. Her eyes tracked the stark white apron tied around my waist. She leaned toward the zoning board director seated to her left, raising her hand to shield her mouth in a performative whisper that was intentionally loud enough to carry. "We offered to pay for etiquette classes." Victoria sighed, shaking her head with manufactured, theatrical pity. "But some people simply lack the genetic capacity to elevate themselves. You can put a stray dog in a mansion, but it will still chew on the imported furniture." The zoning director offered a tight, deeply uncomfortable nod, keeping his eyes glued to his roasted duck. He sliced his meat with exaggerated focus, actively trading his moral compass for the promise of a lucrative zoning permit. The main course progressed in a heavy, oppressive atmosphere. Lawrence sat to my father's right, radiating a slick, deeply satisfied confidence. His midnight blue bespoke jacket strained slightly across his shoulders as he leaned back. Engaging in a rapid-fire discussion with a private equity investor, he aggressively swiped the air with his hand as he explained his fictional, wildly inflated profit margins. He believed his hired thugs had successfully delivered the physical deeds to my corporate empire. He believed he was invincible. As the catering staff moved in to clear the dinner plates, the ambient noise in the room began to settle. My father pushed his heavy chair back, the wooden legs ground harshly against the polished marble floor. He stood up to his full height, adjusting the lapels of his bespoke tuxedo, and picked up his crystal wine glass. He tapped his heavy silver spoon against the delicate rim. The sharp, piercing chimes cut cleanly through the dining room. All conversation ceased instantly. 30 pairs of eyes snapped toward the head of the table in total, obedient submission. William Sinclair looked out over his audience, his chest expanding with absolute, unadulterated arrogance. Ladies and gentlemen, as we conclude this magnificent meal, I feel compelled to speak on the true nature of success, my father began, his deep baritone echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Success is not an accident. It is not handed out to the weak, the uninspired, or the cowardly. It is seized by those who possess the vision to reshape the world, and the absolute pedigree to rule it. He raised his glass slightly, acknowledging the rapt attention of the local politicians. The Sinclair legacy was not built on compromise, he continued, taking a slow, deliberate step away from his chair. Pacing along the edge of the table, he carried himself with the heavy, unyielding momentum of a bulldozer, expecting everything in his path to flatten on command. We have spent decades cultivating an empire that stands as an immortal pillar of this city. We dominate the commercial real estate market because we understand the supreme value of our bloodline. We do not tolerate mediocrity. We eradicate it. My father stopped pacing. He turned his head slowly, locking his cold, calculating eyes directly onto me. He extended his right arm, pointing his index finger straight at my face. And yet, nature occasionally makes a catastrophic error, my father declared, his voice dropping into a cruel, theatrical register. The 30 guests turned in their seats, following his pointing finger. 30 pairs of eyes stared at my faded, shapeless black dress, the stiff white apron, and my calloused hands resting quietly on the table. A few of the private equity investors shifted their weight, their leather shoes squeaking softly against the floor. They were witnessing a brutal, unprovoked domestic execution, yet they offered absolute complicity. "Look at her," my father commanded, his upper lip curling in sheer disgust. 16 years ago, I offered this girl the keys to the kingdom. I offered her a place within the superior Sinclair bloodline. And how did she repay that extraordinary privilege? She rejected it. She chose to roll around in industrial filth. She chose to collect trash in the slums rather than ascend to her rightful place in high society. He took a step closer, his face flushing a deep, mottled red as he leveraged my presence to inflate his own towering ego. "She is a cautionary tale, gentlemen," my father announced to the silent room, a living, breathing example of what happens when a person is fundamentally defective. She wears the uniform of a servant tonight because that is the only station she is mentally equipped to handle. She will always be a failure because she fundamentally lacks the genetic capacity for greatness. Lawrence leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest, a smug, sociopathic smirk stretched across his pale face. He decided to join the public execution, eager to demonstrate his own perceived intellectual dominance. "It goes beyond a lack of ambition. William," Lawrence chimed in, swirling the vintage red wine in his glass. He addressed the table with a slow, patronizing drawl. He tapped his temple with his index finger, mimicking a teacher explaining a simple concept to a slow toddler. "It is a severe intellectual deficit. Sophie simply does not possess the cognitive function to understand real business. She plays in the dirt because the complexities of corporate finance, high-level acquisitions, and leverage capital would completely break her fragile little mind." Lawrence let out a sharp, cruel chuckle. "She is entirely too stupid to comprehend how the real world operates. We just let her clean up the scraps." Victoria laughed, a bright, piercing sound that encouraged the municipal judges to offer their own strained, sycophantic chuckles. The psychological compression in the room reached an absolute, suffocating peak. My father stepped back to the head of the table, reclaiming his crystal glass. He raised it high, holding it steady under the harsh glare of the crystal chandelier. He stared directly into my eyes, ensuring every single person in the room witnessed the final, devastating blow. "You are a stain on this family's history," my father stated, his voice vibrating with pure, concentrated venom. "You own nothing. You have achieved nothing. Look around this table at the titans of industry, the leaders of this city, and understand your place. You are, and you will always be, the absolute poorest, most worthless entity in this room." The dining room fell into a heavy, paralyzed silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The elite guests stared at their plates, waiting for me to break. They expected me to burst into tears. They expected me to push back my chair, bury my face in my hands, and run out of the kitchen doors in complete, shattered humiliation. They wanted a public breakdown to cement their own superiority. I did not shed a single tear. Instead, I reached into my pocket for my phone, knowing the exact second to detonate the charge. The sharp, mechanical buzz of my cell phone sliced cleanly through the arrogant, cruel laughter echoing around the grand table. I pulled the heavy, reinforced device from my pocket and set it down onto the crisp white linen tablecloth, against the delicate crystal goblets and polished silver flatware. The matte black industrial phone looked like a blunt weapon. It vibrated again, the aggressive, rhythmic hum rattling the heavy silver cutlery next to my empty plate. William had just finished declaring me the poorest, most worthless entity in the room. The sudden intrusion of technology shattered his theatrical momentum. His thick eyebrows snapped together, forming a deep, furious trench across his forehead. He gripped the stem of his wine glass so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. "Turn that offensive piece of garbage off," my father snapped, the thick veins in his neck pulsing rapidly against his bespoke collar. "You have already disgraced this family enough for one evening. Do not compound your absolute incompetence with a lack of basic dining etiquette." I did not reach for the device. I kept my hands folded quietly in my lap, staring blankly at the glowing screen. Lawrence leaned forward in his leather chair, a slow, malicious grin spreading across his face. He looked at the flashing unknown number on my display and let out a sharp, mocking bark of a laugh. "No, William." "Wait," Lawrence interrupted, raising his hand in a gesture of exaggerated theatricality. "Let her answer it. In fact, I insist she answers it. It is likely a third-party collection agency tracking her down on a holiday. When you default on the lease for a rusted shipping container, the creditors do tend to get incredibly aggressive." A few of the private equity investors chuckled nervously, eager to watch the public humiliation continue in order to appease their host. "Answer the device, Sophie," Lawrence commanded, aggressively pointing his silver dinner fork down the length of the table toward me, "and put it on speakerphone. Let these esteemed judges and investors hear the grim, pathetic reality of your blue-collar failures. Let them hear exactly what happens when you lack the intellectual capacity to manage basic finances." My father's furious expression smoothed into a mask of cruel, sociopathic approval. He leaned back into his heavy, high-backed leather chair and crossed his arms over his tailored tuxedo jacket. "Yes," William agreed, his deep voice dripping with patrician venom. "Put it on speakerphone, a perfect live demonstration to conclude my toast." I looked at the 30 elite guests. They were leaning forward, their eyes locked onto my small, rigid wooden chair at the far end of the table, entirely eager to consume my degradation as a post-dinner entertainment. I reached out with my right hand. I did not hesitate. I did not show a single tremor of fear. I tapped the green icon on the illuminated glass screen, followed immediately by the speaker icon. I leaned back, resting my spine against the hard wooden rungs of the chair, and let the device sit in the center of my small section of the table. "Go ahead," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, echoing cleanly across the silent dining room. "Good evening, Miss Sinclair." A crisp, impeccably professional voice rang out from the dual speakers of the phone. The audio quality was flawless, entirely lacking the static or compression of a standard cellular call. It was a direct, encrypted satellite line. "I sincerely apologize for contacting you on a holiday, but you explicitly requested immediate notification upon the finalization of the international audits." The aristocratic cadence of the voice did not match the aggressive, frantic tone of a debt collector. The sycophantic smiles on the faces of the municipal judges began to slightly falter. "This is Sterling," the voice continued, projecting loudly across the sprawling mahogany table, "head of Global Wealth Management and Senior Executive Director at the primary municipal bank. Am I speaking with the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Reclamation?" Lawrence's mocking smile froze. The muscles in his jaw locked instantly. The phrase Global Wealth Management hit the air like a physical blow, completely scrambling his fabricated reality. "You are," I confirmed. keeping my eyes locked dead onto my father's face. "Excellent," Sterling replied, the crisp consonants bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. "The board of directors has officially concluded the extensive infrastructural liquidations we initiated in the third quarter. The European Consortium has fully authorized the transfer. The international corporate audits for the recent fiscal years are now completely finalized and permanently sealed." My father stopped breathing. His hands, still crossed over his chest, went entirely rigid. The patrician mask of absolute authority began to crack, microscopic fissures of sheer confusion rapidly spreading across his red face. "And the capital allocation?" I asked, my voice remaining perfectly clinical. "The final, consolidated wire transfers have successfully bypassed the federal escrow holds and settled directly into your primary operating account," Sterling confirmed. "The liquid capital is immediately available for your domestic waterfront acquisition." Lawrence's bespoke midnight blue suit suddenly looked like a straitjacket. He grabbed the heavy edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning a sickly, bone-white hue. He had spent the last 48 hours desperately trying to secure a $60 million shadow loan to save his fraudulent empire from a margin call. The banker on the phone had just casually mentioned a massive waterfront acquisition, the exact commercial territory Lawrence had been fraudulently bragging about dominating all night. "Read the final balance for the official record, Sterling," I commanded. The dining room was so quiet that the faint, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the distant foyer sounded like a swinging sledgehammer. 30 elite municipal leaders sat perfectly paralyzed, holding their collective breath. "Your fully updated, unencumbered liquid assets have been verified," the senior executive announced, his voice carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of absolute financial supremacy. "We are confirming a settled, cleared account balance of exactly $850 million. The sheer magnitude of the number detonated inside the dining room with catastrophic, world-ending force. I reached out and tapped the red icon, instantly terminating the call. The screen went black. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I did not stand up and scream at the 30 elite guests who had just spent the last 2 hours treating me like an illiterate peasant. I simply sat in my rigid wooden chair, wearing the faded black maid's uniform and the stiff white apron, and watched the high society slaughter unfold in absolute silence. The blood violently drained from my father's face, leaving his skin the color of wet, decaying ash. His jaw went entirely slack, dropping open in a silent, suffocating gasp. The towering, invincible monarch who had just declared me the poorest, most worthless entity in the room was suddenly shrinking into a pathetic, hollow shell. He stared at the matte black cell phone resting on the table as if it were an active explosive device. His brain simply lacked the capacity to process the mathematical reality. The daughter he had banished to the industrial slums was holding nearly $1 billion in liquid capital. She was, by every conceivable metric, the wealthiest individual within a 500-mile radius. Lawrence Hayes was actively disintegrating. The heavy, sour sweat that had plagued him all morning came rushing back with terrifying speed. Instantly soaking the collar of his expensive dress shirt, his bloodshot eyes bulged from his skull. Darting frantically between my face and the empty air, the math hit Lawrence with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. Apex Reclamation was not a rusted scrapyard. It was a highly leveraged, global infrastructure titan. And he had just spent the morning bragging about hiring off-the-books thugs to physically break into the headquarters of a near-billion-dollar enterprise. He had orchestrated a massive federal burglary, leaving a pristine trail of digital and physical evidence, assuming he was attacking a defenseless, impoverished target. He had stolen decoy deeds. The massive shadow loan he desperately needed to cover his catastrophic margin call would never be authorized. He was completely, mathematically dead. The 30 municipal judges, zoning board directors, and private equity investors sat entirely petrified. The private investor who had been laughing the loudest just seconds prior was now gripping his chest, completely paralyzed by the realization that he had just publicly endorsed the humiliation of a woman holding enough capital to buy his entire firm and liquidate it for sport. The shifting alliances in the room happened instantly. The sycophantic reverence they held for the Sinclair empire evaporated, replaced entirely by a cold, suffocating terror of the quiet woman sitting at the far end of the table. Victoria sat directly across from her husband, frozen in absolute shock. The manufactured, theatrical pity she had weaponized all night was entirely gone. Her perfectly manicured fingers, clutching the delicate stem of her expensive crystal wine glass, began to tremble violently. The deafening silence that swallowed the dining room was broken only by the sharp, terrifying sound of Victoria's crystal wine glass shattering into 1,000 pieces on the marble floor. The scrape of my chair against the floor sounded like a heavy wooden gavel striking a block in the dead silent room. I stood up slowly. The sharp, terrifying crash of Victoria's crystal wine glass shattering against the polished marble floor still echoed in the vast, vaulted space of the dining room. A dark red pool of vintage wine began to seep across the pristine white stone, mirroring the massive, catastrophic hemorrhage currently destroying the Sinclair corporate ledgers. No one moved to clean it up. The frantic catering staff, entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the financial revelation they had just overheard, stood perfectly frozen near the swinging kitchen doors. I smoothed the stiff, scratchy white apron tied around my waist. I stepped away from my isolated corner and began to walk. The heavy rubber-soled tread of my steel-toed boots thudded rhythmically against the marble floor. With every step I took down the length of the sprawling mahogany table, the oppressive power dynamic in the room violently inverted. The 30 elite municipal officials, zoning board directors, and private equity investors who had spent the last 2 hours laughing at my expense now actively shrank back into their high-backed leather chairs. They averted their eyes, staring blankly at their plates of roasted duck, completely terrified of making eye contact with the woman holding $850 million in liquid capital. Apex Reclamation is not a local trash collection service, I stated, my voice perfectly measured and calm. It did not need to be loud. The silence in the room was so absolute that a whisper would have shattered the surrounding crystal. It is a multi-state industrial infrastructure firm. We hold the primary federal contracts for heavy logistics, structural demolition, and environmental remediation across the entire eastern seaboard. We do not sort through rusted junk. We level obsolete skylines, and we build the foundations of the future. I walked past Judge Miller, the older man, who had eagerly chuckled at my father's cruel jokes just moments prior, now looked physically ill. He reached out with a trembling, liver-spotted hand and slowly pushed his wine glass away, desperately trying to create physical distance between himself and the radioactive Sinclair family. "You brought me here to serve as a visual prop," I continued, stopping for a fraction of a second behind Victoria's chair. My sister was hyperventilating. Her chest heaved rapidly beneath her heavy diamond pendant, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles were completely white. "You forced me into a 30-year-old housekeeper's uniform to artificially inflate your fragile, collapsing egos," I said, looking down at the top of her meticulously styled hair. "You wanted to point at the faded fabric on my back and convince yourselves that your silk gowns and bespoke suits made you inherently superior. You needed an audience to validate an aristocratic illusion that is fundamentally bankrupt." I resumed my slow, deliberate pace until I reached the absolute head of the table. I stopped, standing directly between Lawrence and my father. Lawrence was entirely paralyzed. The heavy, sour sweat that had soaked his collar was now dripping down his pale temples. He stared straight ahead at the floral arrangement of white winter roses, trapped in a catatonic state of pure, unadulterated terror. I reached into the deep, heavy pocket sewn into the seam of my faded black dress. I pulled out a thick, bound stack of premium legal documents. The heavy cardstock was secured by a rigid silver binding clip and heavily embossed with the official, undeniable seal of the global wealth management firm. I dropped the heavy stack onto the polished mahogany. I placed my calloused palm flat against the thick paper and pushed. The document slid smoothly down the table, stopping exactly 4 inches away from my father, coming to rest directly over his pristine china plate. You have spent this entire evening boasting to these municipal officials about your untouchable liquid capital, I said, turning my gaze to my father. William Sinclair stared at the embossed documents. His chest remained perfectly still, his lungs completely forgetting how to draw oxygen. You stood at the head of this table and declared your firm operates with maximum efficiency, I continued, systematically stripping away every ounce of his manufactured supremacy. But that is a spectacular, mathematically provable lie. Kensington Luxury Estates is drowning. You triggered a massive, unrecoverable margin call on your commercial acquisitions. You are currently carrying exactly $60 million in highly toxic, completely unserviceable corporate debt. A collective, sharp gasp rippled down the length of the table. The private equity investors snapped their heads up, looking at William with expressions of sheer, homicidal panic. Their own institutional funds were deeply tied into the Kensington portfolio. They were suddenly realizing they were passengers on a sinking ship commanded by a total fraud. And because institutional lenders require actual capital rather than arrogant toasts, your debt was bundled and sold on the secondary shadow market to an anonymous private equity firm, I stated, leaning forward and placing both hands flat on the mahogany table. I am that equity firm. I bought your $60 million of toxic debt in cash. I own every single asset you falsely claim to possess. My father's hands began to shake. He reached out with a trembling finger and flipped open the heavy cover of the legal portfolio. The top page contained the absolute, undeniable proof of his total ruin. The transfer of debt was complete. The signature lines were notarized. The acquiring entity was listed in bold. Black Ink Apex Reclamation Holding Group. You do not own this estate, I said, my voice dropping into a clinical, merciless register. You do not own the waterfront properties you bragged about. You do not even own the designer chairs you are currently sitting in. The beluga caviar sitting on these silver platters was purchased this evening on a corporate card tethered to defrauded elderly clients. You are mathematically, undeniably bankrupt. I turned my head slowly, locking my eyes onto Lawrence. And in a desperate, pathetic attempt to cover up this total collapse, your chief financial officer orchestrated a physical break-in at my logistics hub just this morning, I revealed, letting the words hang heavily in the freezing air. On the exact same day you sit here drinking imported wine and pretending to be titans of industry, Lawrence hired unlicensed thugs to batter down my doors and steal my property deeds, hoping to forge my signature for a bridge loan. Lawrence let out a quiet, pathetic whimper, a sound entirely devoid of human dignity. Unfortunately for Lawrence, I noted, the cold neutrality of my tone acting as a lethal weapon. My facilities are secured by federal-grade biometric surveillance. I reviewed the high-definition footage this afternoon. I sent the crystal-clear audio recordings of Lawrence explicitly authorizing the corporate espionage directly to my legal team. The federal warrants have already been signed, and the authorities are currently en route to this estate. William slowly turned his head to look at his son-in-law. The realization of absolute, inescapable betrayal washed over his pale, ash-colored face. Lawrence had not just failed to secure the money, he had guaranteed them both federal prison sentences. I looked back at my father, delivering the final, crushing blow. Last night, in your study, you threatened to revoke my grandmother's medical funding if I did not surrender my company to save yours, I stated, the memory of his depravity cementing my absolute lack of mercy. You crossed an unforgivable moral line. You assumed I was powerless. You looked at my faded clothes and you assumed I was the poorest entity in the room. I straightened my posture, towering over the broken, hyperventilating men at the head of the table. I am not the poorest entity in this room, William, I declared, my voice ringing with absolute, unyielding authority. You are a hollow, fraudulent shell of a man, suffocating under the weight of an empire that no longer exists. I watched the patriarch of the Sinclair dynasty bury his face in his trembling hands, completely destroyed by the quiet daughter he had thrown away. Lawrence's slick, sociopathic composure dissolved instantly into a puddle of raw, unadulterated panic as he realized the depth of his miscalculation. His breathing hitched, sounding like a dying engine sputtering for air in the oppressive, suffocating silence of the dining room. The midnight blue bespoke Italian suit that had draped so flawlessly across his shoulders just an hour ago now seemed to swallow him whole. He raised his trembling, sweat-slicked hands, his palms facing outward in a desperate, universally recognized gesture of complete surrender. Sophie, please," Lawrence stammered, the arrogant, patronizing drawl entirely eradicated from his vocal cords, his voice pitched upward, cracking into a frantic, reedy whine that bounced pathetically off the vaulted ceilings. "We can manage this. You are upset, and rightfully so. But we need to look at the mathematics objectively. We can restructure the debt. You hold the paper now, which means we can keep this entirely in-house. We can negotiate a highly favorable amortization schedule. You need an experienced financial officer to guide you through a $60 million transition." He was actively trying to hustle me while standing in the smoldering wreckage of his own fraudulent empire. He genuinely believed that if he threw enough empty corporate jargon into the freezing air, the uneducated sister wearing the faded maid's uniform would simply nod in confusion and hand him the reins to her newly revealed wealth. I did not blink. I reached into the deep, heavy pocket of my black dress for the second time. My calloused fingers brushed past the rough polyester seam, wrapping securely around a small, cold object. I pulled out a heavy, military-grade titanium flash drive. I held it up between my thumb and index finger, letting the harsh, unforgiving light of the crystal chandelier glint off the brushed metal casing. I lowered my hand slowly, placing the drive onto the polished mahogany table directly next to the embossed legal portfolio that contained their absolute financial ruin. The heavy metal drive made a sharp, definitive click against the wood. Lawrence stared at the small silver rectangle as if I had just placed a live, ticking grenade on his pristine dinner plate. "There will be no restructuring." "Lawrence," I stated, my voice echoing coldly across the frozen dining room. "There will be no internal negotiations, and there will certainly be no amortization schedule. You lost the privilege of negotiating exactly 9 hours ago when you decided to escalate your financial incompetence into a spectacular string of federal felonies." I turned my body slightly, addressing the 30 elite municipal officials and private equity investors who were currently holding their collective breath. I wanted them to hear every single detail. I wanted them to understand exactly who they had been sharing vintage wine with all evening. At exactly 9 o'clock this morning, while you were standing in the kitchen drinking my father's scotch and insulting my intelligence, a black sport utility vehicle pulled into the dirt lot of my industrial site, I announced, projecting my voice so it carried to the furthest corners of the vaulted room. 2 unlicensed thugs, men you personally hired off the books, attacked my corporate headquarters. They used heavy steel crowbars and a sledgehammer to violently breach my facility. Lawrence's jaw dropped. A low, pathetic, whimpering sound vibrated in his throat. His bloodshot eyes darted frantically toward the heavy oak exit doors, but his legs completely refused to carry his weight. "They assumed they were robbing a deserted, unguarded scrapyard," I continued, seamlessly weaving the narrative of his absolute destruction. "They did not realize my shipping container office is structurally reinforced with industrial-grade titanium plating and heavily monitored by biometric, high-definition federal surveillance cameras. They broke into my decoy filing cabinet. They stole forged, utterly useless property deeds." I leaned forward, placing both of my calloused hands flat against the mahogany table, and locked my eyes directly onto Lawrence's pale, sweating face. "And then, your hired muscle made a fatal operational error," I said, my tone clinical and completely devoid of mercy. "They called you on a cellular device to confirm the physical theft. They put you on speakerphone. My directional microphones captured crystal clear, high-definition audio of you explicitly ordering them to bring the stolen deeds directly to a drop location, so you could forge my signature and illegally secure your shadow loan. You confessed to corporate espionage, burglary, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud, all recorded in brilliant 4-kilopixel digital formatting. The private equity investors seated around the table recoiled physically, their heavy leather chairs squeaking violently against the marble floor. They looked at Lawrence as if he were actively radiating a lethal, highly contagious disease. That flash drive, I pointed at the titanium rectangle resting on the table, contains a complete unedited backup of the entire morning break-in. However, the original files are no longer in my possession. Sitting in my freezing truck this afternoon, I forwarded the complete digital package to my legal team. They immediately transmitted the evidence to the federal authorities. The warrants have been signed. The federal marshals are currently mobilizing. Lawrence grabbed his chest. He was actively hyperventilating, desperately trying to suck oxygen into his paralyzed lungs. He had dug a hole so deep the sky was completely invisible, but I was not finished burying him. I turned my cold gaze away from my brother-in-law and locked eyes with Judge Miller, the oldest and most influential municipal official sitting at the table. The judge was actively sweating, his tailored tuxedo suddenly looking entirely inadequate to protect him from the sheer scale of the legal fallout rapidly unfolding in front of him. "Judge Miller," I addressed him directly, my voice cutting cleanly through the thick, suffocating tension. "You and your esteemed colleagues were invited here tonight to enjoy beluga caviar and vintage champagne. You were invited to marvel at the supposedly untouched wealth of Kensington luxury estates, but I feel it is my civic duty to inform you exactly how this extravagant evening was funded." Judge Miller swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his tight silk bow tie. He did not speak, absolutely terrified of implicating himself further in the criminal conspiracy. "Just hours before you arrived, I personally reviewed the classified digital ledgers of this firm," I revealed, the absolute authority in my voice pinning the 30 elite guests to their seats. "Lawrence Hayes has been systematically draining the escrow accounts of vulnerable, elderly clients. The $40,000 spent on the fermented grape juice you are currently drinking did not come from liquid corporate capital. It was stolen directly from the retirement trusts of people suffering from severe cognitive decline. He is committing massive, systemic federal wire fraud to fund this performative consumption right in front of you." The dining room erupted into a chaotic symphony of scraping wood and panicked gasps. The 30 municipal judges and elite investors pushed their heavy mahogany chairs away from the table in complete, synchronized horror. They abandoned their plates of expensive roasted duck. Several of them pulled immaculate white linen napkins from their laps and threw them onto the table, desperate to visually sever their ties to the Sinclair family. They were trapped in a room with a man who had just admitted to defrauding the elderly and orchestrating a federal burglary. And they knew the marshals were already on their way. I looked back at Lawrence. He had absolutely nothing left. His arrogant drawl, his bespoke Italian suit, his desperate attempts to secure a shadow loan, it had all evaporated into the freezing air, leaving behind a terrified, broken criminal waiting for the authorities. He collapsed backward into his leather chair, a pathetic, wheezing gasp escaping his lips as he realized I had just publicly read his federal death sentence. The heavy brass deadbolts of the front doors snapped open with a violent crack, signaling the arrival of the final, inescapable consequence. The sound echoed down the grand, vaulted hallway leading directly into the opulent dining room. It was not a polite, scheduled knock. It was the devastating, undeniable sound of a heavy steel breaching ram shattering the reinforced mahogany frame of the estate's primary entrance. The chaotic, rhythmic thud of dozens of tactical boots instantly followed, vibrating violently through the polished marble floorboards and rattling the crystal water goblets resting on the long table. William Sinclair, still staring blankly at the embossed legal documents proving his $60 million bankruptcy, snapped his head toward the entryway. The patrician mask of absolute, untouchable authority had completely melted away. leaving only the pale, frantic expression of a cornered, aging animal. He opened his mouth, desperately attempting to formulate a command, to project his manufactured superiority, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The towering double doors of the dining room burst inward, the heavy wood slamming aggressively against the silk-lined walls. 24 federal agents flooded the opulent space in a highly coordinated, tactical wave. They wore heavy, dark navy windbreakers with stark yellow lettering spanning their broad shoulders. Federal Bureau of Investigation and Securities and Exchange Commission. Their heavy combat boots trampled directly over the shattered remains of Victoria's crystal wine glass, grinding the delicate shards into a fine, sparkling powder against the pristine stone. The sharp, mechanical clicking of tactical belts and the heavy rustle of reinforced Kevlar vests entirely drowned out the delicate classical waltz still piping faintly through the estate's hidden sound system. The 30 elite municipal officials, zoning board directors, and private equity investors instantly panicked, these self-proclaimed titans of industry, who had spent the entire evening chuckling at my expense and boasting about their untouchable wealth, scrambled away from the sprawling mahogany table like frightened, cornered mice. They pushed their heavy wooden chairs backward, pressing their tailored suits and expensive silk gowns flat against the walls. They raised their trembling hands, desperately trying to physically distance themselves from the highly radioactive Sinclair family. Walking seamlessly through the center of the tactical formation was Gregory. My chief legal counsel wore an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, exuding a quiet, lethal professionalism that instantly commanded the chaotic room. He carried a sleek, black leather briefcase in his right hand. He did not look at the frantic local politicians cowering against the velvet drapes. He did not look at the extravagant floral arrangements or the roasted duck growing cold on the fine china plates. He marched directly toward the head of the table, stopping exactly 3 feet away from my father. "William Sinclair and Lawrence Hayes," Gregory announced, his voice a calm, authoritative baritone that sliced cleanly through the frantic hyperventilating of the room. He popped the heavy brass latches of his briefcase. "I represent Apex Reclamation Holding Group. The federal authorities are here to execute multiple high-level felony warrants regarding massive corporate extortion, international wire fraud, and the orchestration of a physical burglary on a secured industrial facility." 4 federal agents immediately flanked Lawrence's high-backed leather chair. My brother-in-law was completely paralyzed. The heavy, sour sweat that had soaked his bespoke midnight blue suit all morning was now dripping rapidly from his chin, staining his pristine white collar. He looked up at the towering federal agents, his bloodshot eyes entirely devoid of basic comprehension. The intricate $60 million shadow loan he had desperately tried to secure had completely evaporated. The fake property deeds his hired thugs had stolen were currently sitting in a sealed federal evidence locker. "Lawrence Hayes," the lead federal agent barked, reaching down and violently gripping Lawrence's shoulder. "Stand up. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and federal corporate espionage." The heavy physical contact shattered Lawrence's catatonic state. He let out a high-pitched, pathetic shriek, throwing his arms over his head in a gesture of absolute, terrifying submission. "No, wait," Lawrence sobbed, a raw, wet sound completely devoid of human dignity. "I was just following orders. It was William. William told me to secure the capital. He forced me to collateralize the bridge loan. I did not know the property deeds were fake. You have to listen to me. I can testify." He was violently turning on my father in less than 10 seconds, entirely desperate to shed the crushing federal weight. The tactical agents ignored his frantic, weeping pleas. 2 heavily armored officers grabbed him by the arms, hauling him forcefully out of his leather chair. Lawrence's knees immediately buckled, his expensive leather shoes sliding uselessly across the marble floor as he entirely forgot how to stand. The sharp metallic ratcheting of heavy steel handcuffs echoed through the dining room as they aggressively pinned his arms behind his back. Lawrence wept openly, hot tears and sour sweat streaming down his red, bloated face. He looked frantically toward his wife. "Victoria!" he wailed, his voice cracking into a pathetic, reedy squeak. "Call a lawyer, Victoria. Do not let them take me." Victoria stood frozen near her chair, her manicured hands clamped tightly over her mouth. Her massive diamond pendant caught the harsh light of the chandelier as she violently shook her head, actively stepping backward into the shadows. She completely abandoned her husband, desperately trying to save herself from the optics of a federal arrest, as the agents dragged the sobbing, thrashing chief financial officer toward the exit. Gregory turned his cold gaze to William. My father was actively hyperventilating. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning bone white, trying desperately to project the image of the untouchable Sinclair patriarch, but his sprawling empire was gone, replaced entirely by toxic debt and federal indictments. "This is a massive misunderstanding," William stammered, his deep baritone violently trembling. He pointed a shaking finger at Gregory. "Do you have any idea who I am? I am William Sinclair. I own the waterfront. I have the mayor of this city on my personal cellular device. I demand you order these officers out of my dining room immediately." Gregory did not flinch. He reached into his briefcase, pulling out a thick, sealed federal indictment folder. He dropped it directly onto my father's empty dinner plate, right next to the $60 million debt portfolio I had delivered just moments earlier. "You own absolutely nothing, William," Gregory corrected, his tone entirely clinical and merciless. "Your assets have been formally frozen by the federal government. The escrow accounts you systematically drained to fund your personal luxuries have been locked and audited by the Securities and Exchange Commission. The waterfront development properties were seized at exactly 8 o'clock this evening to cover your catastrophic margin call." The lead investigator stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "William Sinclair," the investigator stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "You are under arrest for massive federal wire fraud, the illegal misappropriation of client escrow funds, and corporate extortion. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." The devastating reality of his destruction finally penetrated my father's thick, arrogant skull. He was not going to negotiate a quiet settlement. He was not going to leverage his political connections to sweep the fraud under the rug. He was going to spend the final decades of his life rotting in a federal penitentiary. "No," William whispered, the single syllable escaping his lips in a hollow, defeated gasp. "I am a Sinclair. I am a titan of industry. You cannot do this to me. I built this city." "Turn around," the investigator repeated, abandoning the polite protocol entirely. When William refused to move, clinging desperately to the mahogany table as if it were a sinking life raft, the federal agents forcefully intervened. They grabbed the patriarch of the Sinclair dynasty by his tailored tuxedo jacket and aggressively yanked him backward. William stumbled, his polished dress shoes catching on the edge of the heavy Persian rug. He fell hard onto his knees, striking the cold marble floor with a heavy, sickening thud. The 30 municipal elites watched in absolute horror as the towering, invincible monarch of high society was violently pinned to his own dining room floor. The metallic click of the handcuffs snapping around his wrists sounded like the closing of a heavy iron bank vault. They hauled William back to his feet. His bespoke tuxedo jacket was torn at the shoulder, completely ruined. His pristine silk tie hung loosely around his neck. The patrician mask of absolute authority had completely shattered, leaving behind a terrified, broken old man who suddenly realized he was entirely powerless. "Take them both to the federal transport vehicles," the lead agent ordered, gesturing toward the shattered front doors. "Secure the perimeter and begin the asset seizure protocols. Tag everything in this room." The federal agents marched the two ruined men toward the grand foyer. The local politicians and private investors shrank back even further, pressing themselves aggressively into the expensive wallpaper, absolutely terrified of making eye contact with the criminals they had been toasting just 20 minutes ago. I did not move from my spot at the head of the table. I stood tall, the stiff white apron of the humiliating maid's uniform still tied securely around my waist. The harsh, brilliant light of the crystal chandeliers poured down from the vaulted ceiling, illuminating the total annihilation of the Sinclair legacy. The opulent dining room had been transformed into a massive federal crime scene, swarming with tactical officers placing bright yellow evidence tags on the heavy silver platters and imported floral arrangements. I stood perfectly still, watching the federal agents haul my sobbing brother-in-law out into the freezing snow, permanently erasing his fake empire. The grand dining room emptied with the terrifying speed of water, draining from a cracked glass, leaving only the shattered wreckage of a fraudulent dynasty. The 30 municipal judges, zoning board directors, and private equity investors did not politely excuse themselves. They actively trampled one another in a frantic, uncoordinated stampede toward the grand foyer. Heavy mahogany chairs were knocked backward, striking the polished marble floor with violent, echoing crashes. Fine china plates were bumped from the table, shattering into sharp porcelain splinters alongside the discarded roasted duck. Judge Miller, the elderly official who had eagerly chuckled at my public humiliation just half an hour ago, was actively shoving a much younger zoning board director out of his path to reach the heavy oak exit doors faster. They abandoned their expensive wool overcoats in the coat check. They did not wait for the valet attendants to retrieve their luxury sedans. The high-definition audio recorders clipped to the vests of the federal agents captured the frantic crunch of expensive leather shoes sprinting recklessly across the snow-covered driveway. The elite high society circle completely abandoned the Sinclair estate, severing their ties with the terrifying speed of rats fleeing a burning galleon. The federal agents paid absolutely no attention to the fleeing politicians. Their mandate was the immediate, total seizure of the Sinclair corporate and personal assets. The sprawling dining room was instantly transformed from a theater of performative wealth into an active federal crime scene. Tactical officers moved methodically through the vaulted space. They slapped bright yellow evidence stickers onto the heavy silver platters, still holding the imported beluga caviar. They tagged the antique grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. They cataloged the crystal decanters of vintage scotch. Everything in the room was mathematically frozen. Everything now belonged to the federal government. Victoria Sinclair was left completely alone in the center of the devastation. For her entire existence, my sister had operated beneath an impenetrable umbrella of fabricated superiority, but the adrenaline that had sustained her fragile, manufactured ego was entirely gone, replaced by the crushing gravitational pull of absolute ruin. Her husband had been dragged out into the freezing night in heavy steel handcuffs, weeping like a cornered child. Her father had been physically hauled from his own dining room, his aristocratic facade permanently destroyed. The 30 elite guests who had praised her elegant taste just an hour ago had abandoned her without a single backward glance. Her legs gave out completely. Victoria collapsed. Her knees struck the polished marble floor with a heavy, agonizing thud. She fell directly into the dark red pool of spilled vintage wine and the thousands of sharp, glittering shards of her shattered crystal goblet. The expensive silk of her pristine designer gown instantly soaked up the fermented liquid, staining the fabric the deep, oxidized color of dried blood. The jagged glass shards tore through the delicate material, cutting into her skin. But she did not even register the physical pain. She looked up at me. Her meticulously applied makeup was entirely ruined, thick black streaks of expensive mascara running wildly down her pale, panicked face. She was actively hyperventilating, her chest heaving aggressively beneath the heavy diamond pendant resting against her collarbone. "Sophie," Victoria gasped, her voice cracking into a raw, pathetic whimper that bounced hollowly off the vaulted ceilings. "Sophie, please, you have to help me. They froze everything. The lead agent just told me the personal checking accounts are entirely locked. The platinum credit lines are canceled. I do not have a single dollar to my name. Where am I supposed to go? How am I supposed to live?" I stood exactly where I had been placed. I did not rush to her side. I did not drop to my knees in the spilled wine to offer her a comforting embrace. I looked down at the weeping, shattered woman who, less than 2 hours ago, had forced me into a 30-year-old housekeeper's uniform and ordered me to serve her appetizers specifically to mock my perceived poverty. "You have nearly $1 billion, Victoria sobbed, crawling forward on her hands and knees, her palms pressed flat into the sharp crystal shards, the overwhelming psychological terror of poverty completely overriding her vanity. "You hold $850 million in liquid capital. You own the debt. You can fix this. Just give me a fraction, a tiny percentage. I am your sister, Sophie. You cannot just leave me here in the snow with absolutely nothing. I will work for you. I will do anything." I reached behind my back. My calloused fingers gripped the tight, rigid strings of the bright white half-apron she had forced me to tie around my waist. I pulled the knot free. I unwrapped the stiff polyester fabric from my body and let it fall to the floor. It landed softly over the shattered crystal, completely burying the jagged pieces of her broken reality beneath the stark white cloth of a hired servant. "You are not my sister, Victoria," I stated, my voice echoing with the cold, absolute finality of a closing bank vault. "You are simply a passenger on a sunken ship who spent the entire voyage mocking the lifeboats." She reached out, her trembling, wine-stained fingers desperately clawing at the hem of my faded black dress. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, removing myself entirely from her physical grasp. "You spent your entire life believing that your worth was defined by the silk on your back and the catering staff at your command," I continued, staring down at her ruined designer gown and the heavy diamond pendant hanging uselessly around her neck. "You thought wearing expensive jewelry made you untouchable. You thought a bespoke suit could shield a man from the consequences of his own severe incompetence. But true wealth is not worn around the neck, Victoria. True wealth is the structural integrity to survive when the market collapses. You built a life entirely on debt, cruelty, and fabricated prestige. The bill has simply come due." I turned my back on her sobbing, pathetic form. I did not look back at the grand dining table, the tagged silver platters, or the federal agents methodically dismantling the physical remnants of the Sinclair dynasty. I walked out of the dining room without a single ounce of pity. The grand foyer was a chaotic scene of federal marshals cataloging the expensive artwork lining the walls. Gregory stood near the shattered, splintered remains of the heavy mahogany front doors, his black leather briefcase securely in his hand. My chief legal counsel offered a single, highly respectful nod as I passed. I walked through the ruined entryway and stepped out into the freezing Chicago night. The bitter winter wind immediately whipped across my face, cutting straight through the thin, faded fabric of the black dress, but I did not shiver. The frigid air felt incredibly pure. The sprawling circular driveway was illuminated by the harsh, flashing red and blue strobe lights of a dozen federal transport vehicles. I ignored the absolute chaos of the federal raid. I walked past the tactical vans and the armed marshals, my heavy steel-toed boots crunching rhythmically against the freshly fallen snow. My heavy, rusted pickup truck sat exactly where the valet had banished it, hidden away behind the cedar-paneled landscaping shed on the far eastern edge of the estate. A thick layer of jagged frost coated the windshield, reflecting the flashing federal lights in the distance. I pulled open the heavy steel door. The rusted hinges let out a loud, grinding shriek that carried clearly across the silent, snow-covered grounds. I climbed into the freezing cab and tossed my heavy canvas bag onto the cracked vinyl passenger seat. I reached into the pocket of my faded denim jacket, pulled out my metal key, and slid it into the ignition. The engine turned over immediately, roaring to life with a deep, heavy, industrial rumble that violently shook the metal chassis. I reached forward, twisting the plastic dial to turn the heater on maximum capacity. The warm air began to blast through the vents, rapidly melting the jagged frost on the windshield, clearing my line of sight entirely. I rolled the window down a single inch, letting the ambient sounds of the sirens fade into the background. I shifted my truck into drive and pulled out of the towering iron gates, the crisp winter air feeling infinitely lighter in my lungs. The justice system moved with a mechanical, unforgiving ruthlessness, grinding the remaining fragments of the Sinclair legacy into absolute dust. By the blistering, humid summer of 2025, exactly 6 months after the catastrophic holiday dinner, the manufactured empire had been completely eradicated from the Chicago skyline. The sweeping federal indictments had detonated with surgical precision, leaving absolutely no room for backroom negotiations, political favors, or quiet settlements. The federal courthouse downtown offered zero sympathy for the former titans of industry. Lawrence Hayes stood behind the heavy oak defense table in federal court, physically and psychologically hollowed out. The midnight blue bespoke Italian suits he once weaponized to project absolute superiority were entirely gone. He was forced to wear an oversized, stiff neon orange jumpsuit that swallowed his rapidly shrinking frame, a heavy steel chain wrapped tightly around his waist, connected to the rigid metal cuffs locking his trembling wrists together. The slick, sociopathic arrogance had entirely evaporated from his bloodshot eyes, leaving behind the terrified, vacant stare of a trapped animal. His criminal trial had lasted less than 4 days. The high-definition biometric surveillance footage from my industrial facility, combined with the crystal-clear audio recordings of him explicitly ordering the corporate espionage, provided an impenetrable concrete wall of evidence. His expensive defense attorneys had absolutely nothing to leverage. When the federal judge struck his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block, the sharp crack echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Lawrence was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for conspiracy, massive wire fraud, and the orchestration of a physical burglary. There was no possibility of early parole. I sat in the back row of the gallery, remaining perfectly stoic as I watched the armed marshals physically drag my sobbing, hyperventilating brother-in-law out through the heavy side doors and into the dark, mechanical belly of the penal system. William Sinclair managed to avoid the physical confines of a federal prison cell, but his survival was a hollow, agonizing technicality. His defense team successfully argued that Lawrence had operated as a rogue financial officer, shielding my father from the direct criminal conspiracy charges. However, avoiding the iron bars of a penitentiary did not save him from absolute, inescapable civil execution. The Securities and Exchange Commission, armed with the pristine digital ledgers I had forwarded to Gregory, held my father entirely liable for the $60 million in toxic corporate debt and the stolen client escrow funds. The federal government initiated a total, unconditional Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The physical dismantling of his life was a public, highly publicized spectacle. Federal marshals descended upon the sprawling Sinclair estate, executing a ruthless, methodical asset forfeiture. The towering iron gates were padlocked with heavy steel chains. Fleet trucks arrived to tow away the imported luxury sedans. The custom-built mahogany desk where my father used to sit and issue his cruel ultimatums was carried out to a liquidation truck by hourly laborers. The most devastating moment of the forfeiture occurred on the front steps of the estate. A female federal agent calmly instructed Victoria to surrender her jewelry to satisfy the outstanding creditor claims. My sister stood in the freezing slush, weeping hysterically. As the agent physically unclasped the heavy diamond pendant from her neck and dropped it into a plastic evidence bag, they stripped away every single physical marker of her identity, leaving her standing in the cold, completely empty-handed. Banished from the elite circles they had worshipped, William and Victoria were forced into the exact environment they had spent their entire lives violently mocking. Their new residence was a damp, cramped one-bedroom apartment situated directly beneath the elevated commercial railway tracks on the extreme western outskirts of the industrial sector. The air inside the small unit was perpetually thick with the suffocating scent of diesel exhaust, oxidized copper, and boiling cabbage from the neighboring units. The walls were paper-thin, coated in a peeling, sickly yellow paint that stubbornly retained the stale cigarette smoke of a dozen previous tenants. Every 45 minutes, a heavy commercial freight train roared past the single, cracked window, rattling the cheap plaster and vibrating the chipped linoleum floorboards with a bone-jarring intensity. There were no crystal chandeliers. There were no private catering staffs or imported floral arrangements. The opulent grand dining room had been replaced by a tiny, rusted kitchenette featuring a single dripping faucet and a refrigerator that hummed with a loud, mechanical whine. Victoria spent her days trapped inside the suffocating box. The expensive silk gowns and tailored designer dresses were gone, auctioned off by the federal government to repay the defrauded elderly clients. She was forced to wear cheap, shapeless polyester clothing purchased from a local discount warehouse garments that felt exactly like the faded maid's uniform she had maliciously forced me to wear. Without the capital to hire a domestic staff, the brutal reality of physical labor crashed down upon her. Her perfectly manicured hands became calloused, her fingernails chipped and permanently stained from scrubbing the cracked linoleum floors with harsh, cheap chemical bleach. The heavy, unyielding weight of poverty aged her rapidly. The frantic, theatrical energy she used to weaponize against the catering staff was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow, vacant exhaustion. She would occasionally pause her scrubbing, sitting back on her bruised knees, and touch her bare collarbone where the heavy diamond pendant used to rest, weeping silently into the humid, diesel-scented air. William Sinclair, the former monarch of the commercial skyline, was entirely broken. He sat in a cheap, plastic folding chair in the center of the cramped living room, staring blankly at the peeling yellow wallpaper for hours on end. He had no liquid capital. He had no bespoke suits. He did not possess a cellular device. And even if he did, there was absolutely no one left to call. The 30 municipal judges and elite private equity investors who had attended his extravagant holiday dinner had completely severed all ties, instantly treating the Sinclair name like a highly contagious, lethal disease. Judge Miller crossed the street to avoid him. The exclusive country clubs permanently revoked his memberships. My father was completely ostracized from civilized society. He was forced to drink metallic-tasting tap water from a chipped ceramic mug instead of swirling vintage scotch in a crystal tumbler. The man who had proudly declared that he dominated the market because of his superior bloodline was now entirely powerless, dependent on meager government assistance checks just to keep the single, flickering fluorescent bulb illuminated above his head. The psychological compression of their reality was absolute. They were trapped in a rusted, industrial cage of their own making. Every time the heavy freight trains thundered past their cracked window, rattling the cheap plastic plates in their cupboards, they were forced to remember the daughter they had banished to the dirt. The irony of their physical space was an inescapable, daily torture. They were forced to live out the remainder of their days at the absolute bottom of the food chain, suffocating under the very conditions they had viciously deemed suitable only for the fundamentally defective. The self-proclaimed kings and queens of high society were now suffocating under a mountain of debt in a cramped apartment, entirely forgotten by the world they once worshipped. The crisp spring breeze carried the scent of fresh paint and blooming oak trees across the manicured lawn of the newly restored textile mill. By the time the heavy winter snows finally melted, giving way to the bright, optimistic spring of 2026, the remnants of the Sinclair dynasty were nothing more than a faded, unpleasant memory. The suffocating tension of the past year had completely evaporated, replaced by the undeniable, structural reality of what Apex Reclamation Holding Group truly represented. The sprawling, multi-acre industrial site that had once been an abandoned, decaying relic of the city's manufacturing past had been entirely resurrected. I had not authorized the demolition of the historic property. Instead, I had leveraged a fraction of my $850 million in liquid capital to execute a total, state-of-the-art structural restoration. The exterior of the massive building retained its gorgeous, original red brick facade, now meticulously repointed and cleaned of a century of industrial soot. The shattered, boarded-up windows had been replaced with massive, floor-to-ceiling panes of energy-efficient glass that reflected the clear blue sky. The rusted iron girders supporting the vaulted ceilings had been sandblasted, treated, and left exposed, honoring the gritty, blue-collar history of the site. It was no longer a monument to urban decay. It was a sprawling, multidisciplinary community center, featuring advanced vocational training workshops, subsidized childcare facilities, and a sprawling public library constructed entirely from reclaimed, polished oak. I stood on the wide, reinforced concrete steps leading up to the main entrance, feeling the warmth of the morning sun against my face. The atmosphere surrounding the grand opening was the absolute antithesis of the toxic, suffocating Christmas dinner I had endured nearly a year and a half ago. There were no sycophantic municipal judges looking for bribes. There were no private equity investors boasting about fabricated profit margins or draining the escrow accounts of the elderly. Instead, the expansive manicured lawn was crowded with the genuine pulse of the city. The audience consisted of local families, vocational students, and the hundreds of union carpenters, master electricians, and structural engineers who had spent the last 12 months pouring their sweat into the foundation of the building. They were the people who actually built the skyline, rather than the parasites who merely bought and sold the paper deeds. I did not stand before them in a bespoke designer suit or a restrictive silk gown. I did not require the visual armor of high society fashion to validate my existence. I wore a soft, faded green flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up past my elbows, revealing the heavily calloused skin of my forearms. I wore comfortable, durable denim jeans and the exact same, scuffed, steel-toed work boots I had worn while building my empire from the dirt up. I was standing on a multi-million-dollar stage, holding the absolute financial supremacy of the municipal infrastructure market, and I was entirely, unapologetically comfortable in my own skin. Gregory stood to my immediate right, looking incredibly sharp in a light gray tailored suit. My chief legal counsel smiled, a rare, genuine expression of warmth that reached his eyes. He held a custom-engraved silver tray carrying a pair of oversized ceremonial scissors. To my left stood the lead architectural engineer and the foreman of the Steelworkers Union. There was no hierarchy on the concrete steps. There was only the mutual, unspoken respect of individuals who understood the immense value of honest, backbreaking labor. They did not look at me with the fearful, trembling reverence the local politicians had shown my father. They looked at me with the firm, unwavering respect earned only by proving your competence in the trenches. Gregory leaned forward, presenting the silver tray. I reached out, my calloused fingers wrapping securely around the heavy, polished handles of the ceremonial scissors. I looked out over the crowd, taking a slow, deep breath of the crisp spring air. The heavy, psychological compression that had coiled tightly inside my chest for 16 grueling years finally released. The absolute catharsis of this moment was not found in the destruction of my father's fraudulent firm, nor in the federal prison sentence Lawrence was currently serving. The true release was found right here, in the creation of something permanent, beneficial, and real. I stepped forward, aligning the blades of the scissors with the thick, vibrant red ribbons stretched tightly across the main entrance of the facility. I closed my hands, the metal blades slicing cleanly through the fabric. The crowd erupted. It was not the polite, fearful, synchronized clapping of high society elites trying to appease a fragile dictator. It was a massive, thunderous wave of genuine applause, accompanied by loud cheers and the sharp whistles of the construction crews who were immensely proud of the monument they had just completed. The joyful sound echoed off the restored red bricks, washing over me in a warm, validating tide. As I handed the scissors back to Gregory and shook the hand of the union foreman, my mind drifted briefly to the damp, cramped one-bedroom apartment situated beneath the elevated railway tracks on the industrial outskirts of the city. By now, the morning freight train would be roaring past their cracked window, violently shaking the peeling yellow walls of their suffocating reality. William and Victoria Sinclair were entirely erased from the municipal memory. They possessed no capital, no influence, and absolutely no social standing. They were trapped in a perpetual state of exhausting poverty, forced to scrub linoleum floors and drink metallic tap water, entirely isolated by their own insurmountable arrogance. Their fabricated aristocratic illusion had completely shattered, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of their own irrelevance. They had demanded submission because they fundamentally lacked substance. They had built a house of cards in the spotlight, aggressively protecting it with cruelty and manipulation, completely oblivious to the fact that I had spent 16 years building an impenetrable fortress in the shadows. The contrast cemented the ultimate reality of my journey. True power does not scream for attention. It does not require a crystal chandelier or a heavy velvet drape to announce its presence. It does not wear heavy, ostentatious diamonds that weigh down the soul, nor does it ever need to belittle others to manufacture a false sense of height. When you are truly secure in your foundation, you never have to force another human being to their knees just to make yourself feel tall. Real strength is forged in the quiet, dusty corners of hard work. It is built in the freezing mornings inside rusted shipping containers, in the heavily calloused palms of your hands, and in the endless, unyielding patience required to execute a vision that no one else can see. It is the structural integrity to withstand the brutal storms of life without compromising your core values. When you finally stop shrinking yourself to fit into the toxic, suffocating molds created by arrogant, insecure people, the entire world opens up. You realize that you do not need to constantly fight for a seat at a table governed by cruelty and fraud. You realize that the greatest revenge is not a screaming match in a grand dining room, nor is it the temporary satisfaction of a cruel insult. The absolute greatest revenge is simply outgrowing them entirely. You leave them behind in the dirt of their own making, and you step out into the bright sunlight to build your own skyline. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to build your own success? Let me know your story in the comments below, and please hit like and subscribe if you believe hard work always defeats arrogant entitlement.